1. Prologue. When she turned to look back at her life, the woman often thought of how unnecessarily complicated it had been, how many lives had been so unnecessarily impacted. But she hadn't had a choice, she told herself. She had been swept up at the very height of her own power by forces far stronger than she was and set on a path that was not of her own choosing. Events had been made to happen, lies had been told, and there often hadn't been the time to do anything but react. Her heart still ached. It pounded with a pain that time had never quite taken the edge off, never would. Some wounds never healed, some memories layered upon memories could never be erased from one's soul. She would never forget the beat of dragon wings opening to catch an updraft, the fiercely determined gaze of a young man, and in a strong hand encasing her own, and the way that touch had grounded her, fought, and guided her when she had nearly been lost. Even here, in the elaborate and luxurious library of a castle by the sea, her heart ached. She turned her face to the sun, allowing it to warm her and her aching bones. Cousin! A smile, unbidden and tinted with sadness, came to her face as she turned to look at the only person in her world who knew most, not all, but most of what had happened to her. It had all happened so fast, she thought. In under 2 years, or was it 3? She had experienced more than she had ever dreamed possible. "Are you ever going to tell the story?" asked the now gray-haired man. "Stories, cousin, we need to tell them. We were the people who lived in the blank white spaces, in the spaces between the words." "Soon, Taryn," she said. It had been her reply for so long that she had grown used to people dropping it. But Taryn did not, however. "Tell it now," he said, firmly gesturing at an open, blank but bound text where the only words, written in faded ink at the top of the page, were, "I'm coming home." "I promise." "Why now?" "Some stories, Zoe," said Taryn very seriously, "will outlast us all. They may even outlast the lands in which they were created." "Stories have changed," she said dismissively. "And this story isn't black and white, Taryn. The ending isn't happy and things keep overlapping and blurring. It isn't my story any more or yours or even—" The man stepped forward. His eyes burned with an intensity the woman, Zoe, had rarely seen in her normally reserved relation. "Stories will never stop being important, Zoe. They can be more important than anything. They make us human, Zoe, more loving and more alive. I was there too, remember. I was there in the end. I saw what you saw." Zoe turned her gaze to the creamy page, saw the words a much younger self had scribed on the page in a great hurry. She had been so young back then, but she had tried. They all had, and she would lying if she didn't say a small part of her was grateful to have known the pain, the loss, and the love. She had known, even then, what the price was, that it would break not only her but everyone else into pieces. Acceptable losses. The wrong thing for the right reasons, or was that the other way around? She had known, always, that it was not whether she could play the game, it was whether she could stop. "How do I talk about?" Her voice failed, emotion still rising within her despite herself. It made her angry that all it took was a few words to bring her carefully constructed walls down as if they were made of paper, to bring the past roaring back in like a summer storm. "Him," supplied Taryn. The man's eyes took on a distant look, his face growing thoughtful in the warm sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. "You will know when the time comes," he said at long last. "I don't know how to talk about love. It gets inside you, doesn't it? Doesn't leave you. But it's part of this story, such a big part." "Yes," said Zoe thoughtfully. "I suppose you are right, Taryn. It's time. Some things can seem too big, some emotions too huge, but I need to try." Her hand picked up the elaborate feather quill, and she unstoppered the lid on a crystal inkwell. Zoe was lying on a hammock in her mother's flower garden reading a book. It was not often that she indulged in such moments. Neither was it common to find her lying in a hammock drinking lemonade and eating toffee, but today was a rare day, and she was determined to enjoy it. Usually her time was taken up by her rigorous academic schedule, or soccer, or volleyball, or fencing, or some other activity that her parents approved of. One long-fingered hand dropped down to the box of toffee, absently selecting a piece. She was not a particularly attractive girl. Her face was a little too narrow, her eyes a little too sharp, and her body was too lean, lacking any soft curves. Her dark hair was thick and unruly, and usually forced into a braid or yanked back with a tie. But for once, the young woman's face looked relaxed. It lost the slightly pinched, nervous look of completely focused attention that many people found slightly off-putting. Zoe sighed deeply, her eyes leaving the page briefly as she swiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. It was hot and humid. The air was so still and heavy it made the pages stick together. Another summer, reflected Zoe. She knew she should make more of an effort to keep up with her friends, if she could call them that, but it was far easier not to. Just as it was easier, far easier really, to ignore her parents and their jet-setting lifestyle. To ignore the constant, overarching pressure to succeed. To win. She had never been what her parents had wanted, no matter what grades she achieved or accolades she collected. She wasn't sure why it didn't bother her more. Her mother lamented to her girl friends over expensive salads that her daughter wasn't a girl, but an old soul, who didn't have fun and seemed to lack any charm or charisma. A change, Zoe knew. Her mother attributed to Zoe turning 16, although her mother had no idea what had brought about the change. When had things come to seem so dreary? When had her life come to feel like it didn't fit, like it was both constricting and restraining her? Zoe was approaching her 18th birthday, but it felt like it should be her 30th. She wasn't sure when she had come to feel so much older than everyone around her. Was it her new boarding school, the summer spent in France with her aunt? In any regard, it was something that had made her both intriguing and annoying to her peers. It felt strange sometimes, as if she was an outsider looking in on her own life, both amused and bored by the pettiness of it all. Turning back to the page in front of her, Zoe focused once more on the words. An awkward story, she mused, about a boy and a dragon. But it was a good story despite it all. It had a real edge to it, although her friends thought she was crazy for thinking that all. Let them read their Great Gatsby and Hamlet, thought Zoe. She wasn't like them. She would find the kernel of honesty and hard grittiness in this tale of a boy and his dragon. Somehow she knew that she could, that she would mark her own path as well as she knew her own name. Zoe was so engrossed in the book that she didn't notice it, at least not until it was too late. She didn't hear the faint hum or see the way the leaves began shake as if there was a wind blowing. She would often wonder later, like most people who find themselves in similar situations do, what would have happened if she had just shut the book. Would whatever magic was awakening have faded? Zoe didn't realize what was happening until the book in her hands began to glow. It was not a small shimmer, but a brilliant white light that grew and grew until Zoe was blinded by it. She tried to throw it away, but before she could act, there was a terrible lurch. The world spun and Zoe found herself falling into a tunnel of endless light that was coming from the book. The magic was pulling her downwards, or was it upwards? Everything was a blur of color and light, until it ended quite suddenly. Whatever magic was holding her suddenly let go, and Zoe was falling through empty space until she hit hard, cold, and quite solid ground. Her head hit something solid, and blackness claimed her. Just as she blacked out, Zoe thought she heard a faint voice say, "Good luck, little one," but it could just have been her imagination. 2. Unexpected Visitor. Starts on page 138 of Eragon. Note, I do not own anything expect for Zoe. A small, smokeless fire was already burning when Eragon entered the clearing. Brahm sat next to it, tending his arm which he held at an awkward angle as he attempted to clean the worst of the blood and grime off. Saphira was crouched beside him, her body tense. Eragon opened his mother, and then froze. Something made him still, the change coming so suddenly it made him freeze, motionless in the small clearing. A sense, a gathering power that charged the air with energy. It came suddenly, like a summer storm or an avalanche triggered by a careless footfall. It was a defining moment reached, a blazing rush of pure energy that was soundless but deafening all at once, and a force that sent the rider staggering backwards. Crack, the sound was deafening. It echoed on and on. Eragon caught his balance, grasping at a rough branch in an effort to steady himself. Spots danced before his eyes. His mind reeled as if he had been dealt a blow to the head. He felt Saphira's panic, felt her ready to roar, to fight, but the power was gone from the cool air. The air stilled, the force vanishing, and all that was left was a sense of emptiness, a void. But not quite, he realized as he turned his gaze to Brahm and Saphira. There was an unmoving body in the middle of the clearing. A girl, in fact. Silence filled the small clearing. It was Brahm who moved first. Cautiously, he drew as his sword as he did so, moving towards the unconscious girl. He nudged her with his foot. She was unresponsive, a limp form on the cold, wet grass. But she was not unarmed. Iragan noticed that a sword was strapped to her slender waist. A bow and matching quiver, as well as a hunting horn, was slung across her back. The sword's sheath was a plain black, scuffed and worn as if it had been used a great deal. The quiver was similarly worn, although the bow itself gleamed with a strange luminescence when the moonlight caught it. Brahm, crouching by the limp form, turned and spoke in a soft voice. "Bring me some rope and set a blanket by the fire." Hurrying to obey, the rider remained quiet as he tied the girl's hands behind her back and lifted her slight form to a blanket set by the fire. Her clothes were a close-fitting mix of padded black leather and sturdy cloth, and her hair was a rich, dark brown. It fell in soft waves around her pale face. Her hands, when Iragan drew them back, were the softest hands he had ever felt after a lifetime around farmers and hard-working common folk. She did not look like a commoner, rather like someone used to the finer things of life. Her thick cloak alone, noted the rider, was the finest he had ever seen and pinned neatly at her throat with a silver brooch. "Look what I found." Brahm was holding a black bag up for Iragan to see. Brahm brought it to the fire, and after a few minutes spent struggling with the buckles, drew out the contents. It contained clothes, small packages of dried food, a spare pair of knee-length boots, a small pot, eating utensils, a small bag of gold coins, a box of matches, and 3 or 4 books. Gently Brahm lifted one of the books out so they could examine it. Either this young lady is an accomplished thief, or she is a very wealthy young noble. It was true, thought the rider. Not only were the books crafted out of a strange, glossy paper with perfectly formed letters on every page, but the clothes and boots were of high quality as well. But it was the weapons, above all, that drew his gaze. Brahm was similarly interested as he slipped the contents back into the bag. "I've never seen a bow like that," he mused. "Not since, well, not since what?" demanded the rider. Any and every chance to probe at the elder man's past was an opportunity he could not refuse. "Never you mind," snapped the older man, cradling his arm. "And I haven't felt power like that since I was a very young man. That was old magic, boy." Reaching out, Iragan touched the black quiver and slipped the bow out. It was a great deal longer than his own, and it was made of slivery wood that shone dimly in the thin moonlight. Stylized leaves had been carved into the weapon, giving it an elegant, refined look. Standing, the rider attempted to draw back the string only to find it remained, stubbornly, unbent. It was too tight for him. Surely, he thought, it must be too tight for this slim-figured girl. Brahm grunted. "Don't bother, boy," he said. "Put it back." The rider felt a twinge of reluctance as he slipped the bow away. It was beautiful and made his own simple weapon feel like a child's toy. "Who is she, Sapphira? I've never seen a girl before," said the dragon curiously. "She makes my scales scratch." "Something, little one. Something has happened. What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said cautiously. For the first time that he could remember, Iragan got the impression that his partner of heart and soul was deeply uncertain. "I just know that this wasn't what was intended. That magic, it wasn't just old magic, little one. It was different." The rider shivered, uneasiness growing within him as he considered Sapphira's words. "Look at the sword," said Brahm with a nod. "You might as well get used to looking at swords, boy. It is too narrow, too light to stand against a sword like Zarok in a contest of strength. It is meant for speed, for someone able to plan and manipulate a duel to suit their skills which lie in speed and technique." The rider stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the black-sheathed sword. "What's more dangerous? The one most committed to winning," said the man. "Never forget that, boy. Power is empty. It takes as much as it gives. But strength, now strength, is different. This sword, in the hands of someone who is both trained and determined to win." The man rested a hand on the simple but elegant handle of the blade. It too, like the bow, glinted with a silver light and had been carefully adorned with twirling vines and leaves similar to the bow. Something in runes Iragan had never seen before had been etched into the pommel. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but strangely savage too. I suppose she could have people looking for her. "Do you think she is a noble? She doesn't look like a thief." "We will have to wait until she wakes up before we know. Until then, leave her alone. Whoever she is, she hit her head hard, and I need to look after my own wound. I am also very curious as to hear how you killed those Urgles." A sick feeling grew in Iragan's stomach. He didn't know what had happened, had no idea how to explain the rush of power that ignited within. The sense of a wall being broken, of something alien and wondrous filling every part of him, making him feel as if he had just jumped off a very high cliff into icy water. He had felt alive. The magic, the power had made him feel alive, and it frightened him. So much power, so much, and it was hungry. He had been exhausted after only one small usage. Had he not ended the flow, shut it, and let it ebb away, it would have killed him. I wouldn't have let it, snapped Saphira. You couldn't stop it, he said quietly. I didn't even know what it was when I used it. Brahm boiled water to cleanse his wound. It wasn't deep, but it was painful. While Iragan skinned a rabbit, Brahm tied a fresh bandage around the cut and lit his pipe. Iragan couldn't help but look at the unconscious girl. Her pale face was illuminated by the fire. When their bellies were full and warm, Brahm relit his pipe and rested his good arm on his sword. Now I think it is time for you to tell me what happened when I was unconscious. Iragan nervously clasped his hands and told the story without embellishments. Brahm remained silent, and when Iragan finished, he sighed. Have you ever used this power before? Before Iragan could reply, Saphira spoke. The girl is beginning to stir. I don't want to frighten her, so I will remain out of sight. Saphira was right. The girl had begun to move. She shifted uneasily on the blanket, and her eyelids fluttered. Brahm gestured for Iragan to remain where he was before he knelt beside her. With a small groan, the girl's eyes opened. They were a soft blue-gray, and at that moment they were confused and frightened. Where? Where am I? Her voice carried a strange, lilting accent. She tried to rise, but Brahm gently pushed her back. His left hand rested on the pommel of his sword, while his right was firmly placed on the girl's shoulder. It was both reassuring and threatening, the elder man's eyes as hard as flints. I would lie still if I were you. You banged your head quite hard. Now what is your name? Brahm's voice was gentle, but the girl flinched away and forced herself into a sitting position, wincing as she moved, her face growing more pale as she found her hands tied behind her back with coarse rope. My name is Zoe. Where am I? Who are you? It was then that she caught sight of Iragan sitting by the fire, and then, in turn, the glittering bulk of Saphira crouched on the other side of the camp. She gasped. A dragon. But the moment was gone, and her fear quickly changed to outraged anger. She whipped her head around to look at Brahm, her eyes sparking dangerously. Who are you? This can't be real, dragons. They don't exist. Not, Iragan noted, the expected dragons are dead, or something along those lines. It was more as if the girl didn't think dragons were or had ever been real. I am real, said Saphira. Brahm sighed. You are close to village of Yazuak, just east of the spine. You arrived quite strangely, a bang and a flash of light. We have been waiting for you to wake up for a few hours now. My name is Neil, that is my cousin Evan, and the dragon is called Saphira. The girl's eyes narrowed, and she seemed lost in thought. She had gone very still, no long pulling at her bands, her face devoid of any expression. There was a focused energy about her, an intensity which spoke more of purpose than of nervousness. It was such a sudden change, as if the girl had suddenly become someone much, much older. You are lying. The words were flat, unemotional, but there was a cool bite to them. I told you my name. Brahm rocked back, eyes narrowing, and Sapphire let out a low growl. You are very perceptive, said Brahm evenly, though his hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. Perhaps, but I think it is merely because I am well informed. Her gaze never left Brahms. It was not outright challenging, but Iragan had the distinct feeling that, despite being bound and outnumbered, she wasn't intimidated. It was she, not Brahm, that controlled the situation. And you have a rather legendary reputation. Brahm eyed her narrowly and demanded bluntly, Are you a spy? She looked genuinely surprised. No, I'm just Zoe. I don't serve. She suddenly stopped and shook her head, wincing. I don't serve anyone. She pulled at her bands once more. Would you untie me? And let you pull that sword, snapped Brahm. It was clear that, whatever interrogation skills Brahm may have normally had, they had been worn away by a mix of the day's dangerous and strange events and the girl's words. She looked genuinely surprised. What sword? Then she glanced down, her eyes widened almost comically. I see, she said very slowly. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I haven't the faintest idea how to use it. I would probably cut off my own hand before I did anything to a master like you. Then why? Began Iragan, glancing at Brahm, only to stop as the man sent him a dark glare. Not sure, she said. It was a sudden change. Her face and voice had lost the focused energy, the power that made her seem far more dangerous. Now she seemed lost and very much alone and confused. She was young again, the other presence fading away. "Where are you from?" Brahm's voice cracked through the air, hard and demanding. "United States of America," she said without hesitation. "But I am guessing you haven't heard of it." "No," said Brahm. "I think you should. You can look into a person's mind," she said suddenly. "Can't you?" Before Brahm could reply, she continued, "Go ahead. Look into my head and then get these ropes off." Brahm's face went very still, and Iragan, along with Sapphira, waited quietly. After a few minutes, Brahm shook his head, looking wearier than before. "I suppose we can trust you," he said at last. "You really are from another world." "Yes," she said. "I suppose I am." "And you know the future," said Brahm as he reached out and undid Iragan's knots, "because of some books that you by chance read." "What?" demanded Sapphira, broadcasting both her and Iragan's confusion along with a low growl that threatened more decisive action if explanations weren't offered. "I am sorry," said Zoe. "I am from another world, another place entirely. In that place there are a series of books, and in those books I read about you, Sapphira, and Iragan, your rider." Zoe rubbed her wrists and sat forward slightly, an earnest looking coming onto her face. "I don't know what magic brought me here, but it did." "You will come with us," said Brahm coolly. The elder man stood. "We can't have you running off to the king." Iragan swore he heard Zoe mutter something like, "I wouldn't dream of it." "Boy," said Brahm, "I will take first watch." "All of you," he cast Zoe a suspicious look, "go to sleep." The tone booked no argument, and so Iragan, with difficulty, muzzled his questions. He didn't know why, didn't understand half of what Zoe had just said about other worlds and books, but he had the distinct feeling some line had just been crossed. Some unspoken boundary, a line he had been walking between two extremes, had just been irrevocably changed. And somewhere, in all of the magic and enchantment, this girl, Zoe, factored. The question now, however, was where it left him and Sapphira. "Together," said Sapphira as she covered him with her wing, forming a blue tent above him. Nothing will ever change that. She had never slept on hard ground with nothing between her and the cold grass but a thin blanket that smelled of horse. Above her was the night sky. It shone and sparkled with more stars than she had ever seen in her entire suburban and city life. Zoe found herself oddly enjoying it. Part of her, a very, very small part, wanted to associate it with a sense of right, of home. Despite her aching head and the questions that buzzed endlessly in her mind, Zoe found herself drifting off to sleep. Her body was sore. Her entire world had been turned upside down and undone all in a single blinding moment. Her mind, unable to process everything, simply shut down. So she dreamed. She dreamed of a wide, high-roofed room with no furniture or windows. It was lit by a collection of glowing lights along the dark walls. She was holding a sword, and she was moving in and out of forms as easily as if she was breathing. All the grace and poise, the elegance of her step and movements were perfectly coordinated. Her sword flashed and danced, coming around with a nimble twist which took her weight from right foot to left, then back in a complete turn of direction. The blade transferred between hands as it whipped about her body, staying always between herself and her imaginary opponent. It felt right. The sword was an extension of herself. She was a graceful and savage all at once, but completely in control, completely balanced between the two. Chapter 3. Zoe woke with a groan. She was sore and stiff, unused to sleeping on frozen ground. A rock was digging into her side, and cold, wet grass had made her thin blanket and cloak damp. No one, even the blue dragon, appeared to be awake despite the approaching dawn. The fire had burned to a few smoldering coals, and Zoe shivered. It was cold. Drawing her legs up to her chest, the girl absently rubbed her arms and gazed unseeingly into the faintly glowing coals. Why wasn't she more scared? Panicked? True, she felt very odd, as if she was at once taller but closer to the ground. She felt steadier in herself in a moment when she should feel very out of her depth. She had a sword, a really, honest-to-God sword, and was under 20 feet from a real live dragon. Not only that, but she knew them all without them knowing or exactly trusting her. She knew exactly how their stories would play out from this moment onward. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Zoe remembered the feeling of Brahm's mind brushing against hers. It had been so odd, and yet she had welcomed the connection. She had opened herself to him, beckoned him in, and willingly shared her story with him. But only up to a point. It hadn't been hard, a conscious decision that she would not share what she knew, only that she knew it. Somehow she had known how to guide him, how to open her memories to him, although it was something she had only read about in books. It was dangerous, she thought. Every single thing she knew, no matter how small and inconsequential, was dangerous. And this was a dangerous world, far more dangerous than those books had let on. She had always thought they had been too simple. Reality rarely had such clear lines between good and evil. Unconsciously, her hand lingered on the horn that was firmly strapped to the quiver slung across her back. Undoing the straps, Zoe brought the horn around and gazed at it curiously. It had been carved in the shape of a roaring lion, its tiny sapphire eyes flashing fiercely. Runes had been etched along the silver mouthpiece, and tiny gems had been set into it. It was easily the most beautiful and strange thing she had ever seen, let alone held. Where had it come from? It was old. She knew that much. The runes etched deeply into the surface teased her with their hidden meanings. Replacing the horn, she dropped her hand to the hilt of the sword that was firmly strapped to her side. The sword was a classic design, but despite its obvious value, there were numerous nicks and scratches from years of use. The stylized leaves on the crossguard had been worn smooth. It, like the obvious marks of use on the bow and quiver, took away any pretension it may otherwise have had. The grip and hilt worn mirror-smooth in places. A work of art, but understated and unassuming, belying its deadly nature. It felt steady but dangerous at her side. It was a weapon meant to take and press home an advantage. Who had made this sword? Given it such a plain sheath, and then passed it along to her in the blur of a portal from Earth? What was its story? Or even more interesting, who else had carried this blade? She sat still and silent for a long time, knowing that she could not stand and make to leave the camp without one of the other three becoming aware of it. Finally, Aragon emerged from under Saphira's wings, his hair tousled and his eyes tired. He glanced at her, a nervous expression flickering across his face before glancing quickly away and focusing on reigniting the fire. He had very open eyes, she thought. They were open and passionate, a deep warm brown that sparked with 1,000 questions. He was likable, his open honesty charming instead of grating. A farm boy, an inner voice said in a faintly calculating voice, not yet even half a soldier. Still finding his way in the larger world, fated for greater things. But his hands bore no calluses from weapons use. Her inner voice continued, and he was too unaware. He didn't look and really see. A flicker of unease made her look away from Aragon. How did she know all this? Brahm rose, breaking her train of thought. The elder man didn't trust her, and she couldn't blame him. She had dropped from the sky in a blinding flash of magic, and if that wasn't enough, she had claimed to be from another world. Part of her was surprised he hadn't thrown her in the river that ran not too far away. "Girl," said Brahm coldly, "come here." Uneasy, Zoe rose and moved slowly over to the elder man. Her head ached still, and she had to blink rapidly to clear her vision as she came to a stop beside him. "Yes," she asked. "You will ride with me," said the man shortly. Breakfast was short affair, cold stew that Zoe forced herself to swallow. As they prepared to leave, Brahm gestured at a small pack close to his own. "I believe that is yours." Zoe, curious, undid one of the thick buckles and pushed the leather flap back. The contents were practical, and she wondered at where they had come from. However, her hands lingered on 3 well-loved and much-read books tucked safely into the bag and half-wrapped in a dark blue tunic. Zoe instantly recognized the books. She touched one of the spines, a clawing, choking feeling in her throat. Somehow, despite everything, she had some things to call her own that were recognizable things that had belonged to her, familiar in their well-thumbed pages. Blinking rapidly to clear the tears from her eyes, Zoe stood and allowed Brahm to fasten the pack to his saddle. Out of all the things to affect her, she thought angrily, it had to be the sight and smell of those pages. "Where did you get the books?" came Aragon's voice from behind her. It was the first time he had spoken to her. "Oh," said Zoe, turning with a faint smile. "They are from home. I'm not sure how they ended up here." "They are very well." Zoe smiled at his awkwardness. "I think they're beautiful. Books have their own magic. Did you know that?" "I wouldn't," said Aragon with a candid air. "I've never read one." He promptly blushed then, his eyes flicking away from her. "I'll teach you," said Zoe instantly. "It's very easy." "You would teach me?" Zoe laughed lightly. "I can think of no better thing to do." When everything was packed and the fire erased, Brahm looked Zoe up and down. He was holding Snowfur's reins with his good hand. Iragan had just mounted Kadok and was waiting for on the edge of the clearing. "Have you ever ridden before?" asked Bram. Zoe shook her head. Her limited equine experience wasn't even worth mentioning. "We don't use horses much for transportation in my world." Bram grunted, and after a brief explanation, gave Zoe a boost up behind the saddle. They rode in silence, Saphira flying above them, a distant speck against the vast blue sky. Zoe had never seen so much open space. It was overwhelming and exhilarating all at once. The slightly uncomfortable silence was broken some time later by Bram. "Tell me," said the elder man, "how exactly you escaped the Urgles, Iragan." An uncomfortably long pause made Zoe wince. She had a sudden urge to leap in and explain everything as if she was an over-eager 6-year-old. But she restrained herself. It was not her place to teach Iragan, and it was definitely not her place to go around blabbering. "What did I do? I have searched for an answer to this question, but so far I haven't found an answer." His face set in an expression of stubborn curiosity. Iragan seemed quite willing to forcibly drag the answer out of Bram. Bram glared at his horse's ears for a minute before saying, "What you are asking about is dangerous, and you are lucky you didn't destroy everything around you, including yourself." Iragan was not put off in the slightest by Bram's reaction. Maybe he was used to it after traveling with the old storyteller. "But what did I do?" Zoe winced. There was an uncomfortable balance in the relationship between rider and mentor. Bram kept his young charge's interest by slowly and carefully feeding out chunks of information and advice. But it couldn't be sustained, Zoe thought. Iragan tested too many boundaries, needed information if he and Saphira were to survive. How did Bram expect his charge to survive if all Iragan knew was black and white? How could he bring down an entire empire, a task at which practiced veterans had failed? Yet he still expected Iragan to be willingly patient. Worse was the simple fact that Bram willingly allowed Iragan to go on not knowing his parentage and consequences of it. It was a profound weakness that was easily remedied, except that, she thought, would interfere with Bram's goals. "Tell the truth," she silently urged Bram. "Otherwise he will go through a good chunk of the next few months alienating and frustrating everyone." "You aren't ready for it," said Bram with an air of finality, declaring the subject officially closed. Iragan looked ready to explode, his face flushing and his mouth opening to protest. "I think," said Zoe, "you need to think about this, Iragan." The words slipped out before she could help herself. Bram, sitting directly in front of her, visibly tensed. "What?" said the rider, his anger changing to confusion. "What did you do?" said Zoe. "You faced an Urgle and you said something, didn't you? You were trapped and alone. You didn't have any other options, so you acted. You reached inside yourself and found something, a new part of yourself." The rider was fixated on her, his intense brown eyes never leaving her. "What?" continued Zoe. "Do all the stories say about riders? There is only one answer, Iragan, only one thing that could have happened. I used magic." The rider turned his gaze to the very quiet Bram. I did, didn't I? Why won't you tell me?" "It's dangerous," said Bram coldly. "Far more dangerous than you could know. Magic has rules, and if you break them, the penalty is death. Your deeds are limited by your strength, the words you know, and your imagination." "Brissinger," said Iragan quietly. "What does it mean?" "Fire," said Bram. "It is a word from the ancient language that the elves brought over the sea. It is the basis of all power." Zoe remained silent as she listened to Bram explain the different rules of magic and the various kinds of magic users. As the morning wore on, she watched quietly as Iragan attempted to use magic to lift a pebble. But she didn't really listen to his exasperated comments and Bram's quiet humming. She was staring out at the unending plains, wondering and thinking. The only time she tuned into the conversation was when Bram taught the rider a piece of vocabulary from the ancient language. When Bram finally stopped the horses, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, she dismounted stiffly. Saphira was waiting for them, her bright blue scales glinting in the fading light. No doubt, she thought grimly, she would be sore tomorrow. Allowing her muscles to relax, she watched Iragan and Bram spar in an open space close to the fire that Iragan had coaxed into existence. Saphira curled close by, her great blue eyes almost closed. As Iragan flopped down beside Saphira, his hair sweaty and his ruby-red Zarok still held in his right hand, Bram gestured at Zoe. "Spar with me." A sudden change came over her. The words seemed to access some other part of her, awakened it. So simple, a few syllables, but it triggered a sudden flicking on somewhere inside of her that made her feel as if she was both more alive and more calm, a centering between her head and her heart. As she rose, her mind analyzed the situation before her. She was slim-framed, her height a little less than Brahm. Her sword and build demanded that she keep in constant motion, supplying momentum in order to make up for the lack of weight and heft. Strong Brahm might be, a voice analyzed, but she had not only speed but technique. Her body was nimble and agile. He was experienced but much, much older and not as quick to react. His senses slower than hers, and his muscles did not react fast enough. She wasn't scared. She wasn't in slightest. "I've never done this before," she warned the older man. "Keep the tip up," said Brahm, "and try not to stab yourself." Drawing the blade out of the sheath for the first time, Zoe divested herself of both cloak and quiver before moving to the open space where Brahm waited. "Aren't you going to guard the edge?" asked Zoe. "No," said the man. Zoe opened her mouth to protest but thought better of it. If Brahm wanted to force her show her cards, to divest any lingering mystery that she might have been lying the entire time by refusing to guard the edge of her sword, then fine. They began to circle, Zoe automatically following his movements. Brahm moved first, his sword whipping up, trying to force her onto the defensive and catch any clumsy move she might make with her own sword. She couldn't let that happen. A voice screeched inside her head. She had to take the opportunity and move. Her sword was a blur of motion in her hand. It was no longer an awkward, heavy, unwieldy thing that she gripped far too tightly. It was between her and her opponent as it should be. It was an extension of her. She knew these moves. They were deeply ingrained somewhere inside of her body remembering without her mind doing it. Brahm stumbled back, balance thrown off by the collision of his own sword with Zoe's. Whipping her blade up and around, Zoe forced him to continue to back up. But Brahm was experienced, and he was not willing to be led into her trap, which meant, whispered a voice, she had to let him think he had one. She allowed her sword to drift away, to fall and leave her exposed and vulnerable. A beginner's mistake that she had seen Iragan make more than once that evening. Brahm attempted to be wary, but his half-hearted attempted at a thrust was all it took. Whipping her sword up in a lightning-fast blow which leveled out at Brahm's chin, Zoe made him bring his sword up sharply in order to block, but in doing so, he allowed Zoe far too close. In the same instant as their sword met, Zoe slipped forward, locked her leg around Brahm's, and dropped him hard to the ground. His sword went flying, leaving her to quietly lower her own and step away. She was sweaty. Her breath was coming fast, and she felt slightly light-headed. The rushing, calm feeling was fading away. She felt unbalanced. The sword had returned to its awkward, clunky feeling. Brahm rose slowly. He was watching her intently, and behind him, Iragan and Saphira remained completely still. "You said you couldn't fight," said the older man calmly, "that you had never held a sword in your life." "I haven't," said Zoe quietly. A sudden urge to cry came up inside her, and she had to turn away. "I don't know how I know what to do. I don't." She turned back, biting her lip hard. "I'm sorry." "You don't trust me, and you shouldn't. I don't know what's happening." The man was regarding her. "You aren't afraid of a real blade." He stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you take risks. That blow leaves you wide open to attack for a good half-second as your arm swings back if your opponent has fast reflexes. It is a useful blow, but there are others." "Aye." But she didn't know what to say. She knew that tears were beginning to form in her eyes, and she desperately willed them back. She wouldn't cry, she wouldn't. "I think," said Brahm, "you have to remember who you are. I don't think you are lying about who you are, Zoe." The older man rested a hand on her shoulder, "But I think you don't know the full story." "I don't," she said quietly. "It feels right, but it should feel wrong. I've never fought someone before." "Perhaps," said Brahm. "But then again, Zoe, some part of you clearly does know." For traveling. The next few weeks passed in a blur of aching muscles and slowly defrosting tensions between Zoe and her new companions. The landscape was plain, brown, windswept plains with blue horizon stretching as far as the eye could see. Zoe had never seen so much open space, the openness reminding her of the tinted photos of the American West before it had been settled. It appealed to her. It made the glossy newness of her urban lifestyle seem shoddy and overused. She had never realized how much she longed to be free of the constraints of her mundane teenaged life. She listened a great deal, occasionally asking questions and pushing Brahm, gently but firmly, to branch Iragan's education out from basic survival to history, verb conjugations, political and magical theory. The man seemed to take these not-so-subtle hints in stride, pushing Iragan, and by extension, Zoe to remember growing lists. His knowledge was vast, and once he began teaching, he seemed unable to stop. Iragan, for his part, focused harder on his lessons now that he had someone to compete against. But perhaps the best part was the time Zoe had to think. She thought about her knowledge, the terrible burden of knowing what the future was supposed to have been before her less than graceful arrival. It weighed heavily on her. The implications were many and multifaceted. She knew that she could not risk drastically changing the course of their travels. It was important for Iragan to meet Jowd both for his story and for Roran's much later on. The first major crossroads, then, would be the Urgel's attack, where Iragan inadvertently revealed himself to the king's freshly recruited and very dedicated army. She had a responsibility. When the time came for her to act or to hold back, Zoe decided she had to be ready. She could afford no weakness, no fractures in her reasoning that might leave her open to self-doubt, and that meant remembering. It meant uncovering exactly why she could do things, feel things, and sense things that she had never been able to before. If she was a part of this story, then she had to be aware of her part in it. If nothing else, she would attempt to be thorough. Occasionally she felt like she remembered, like she stood on the edge of understanding, half a step away from unraveling the mystery of it all. Once or twice, an image would flash across her eyes, or a half-remembered conversation. A vague impression of words and sounds would make her start slightly, and she would experience a brief flash of something. But they never lingered. They came, and they went too fast for her to make much sense of whatever she saw. A white-walled room, or a field of barley, or a ghostly laugh. Music was there to faint chords of a melody that wrapped around her, and then faded away, leaving on a faint impression of itself. It frightened her. So many things frightened her. Her lack of homesickness, only a faint, nagging sense of guilt. She didn't miss home like she should. She felt as if she had shed a life that had never fit and had no need to mourn the loss. It was gone, her hands washed clean, and it was time to move on. Her mind had already made peace with that. She remembered some things vividly: the taste of chocolate, the whiz of cars on wet pavement, and the feeling of a ball-point pen in her hand. But the important things, like her mother's face, the color of her bedroom, or her cell phone number, had faded, become fuzzy and distant. Her skills, from the oddly patchy nature of her swordsmanship, at once deadly and then amateurish, to the implacable walls that, according to Brahm, surrounded her mind like an iron fortress against intrusion. Well, the list went on. Now what? In a land of mind readers, magic users, and dragons, where was her place in all of this? "You are always thinking," came the deep voice of Saphira. Zoe, sitting cross-legged by the fire while Brahm and Iragan sparred, smiled slightly. "There is a great deal to think about, but I always come back to the same question." The dragon, who rarely interacted with Zoe, hummed. She had grown quite a bit over the past 3 weeks. Her wingspan had close to doubled, and what with the constant flying, the dragoness was lean and powerful. Sapphire blue scales glinted in the dim firelight, casting a faint blue glow on the small camp. Zoe turned back, watching as Iragan pulled the blade of his sword up just in time. Brahm had just moved the young rider from sticks to real blades fully, and the rider was clearly finding the additional weight to be a challenge. But he was getting better. His moves were becoming smoother and more powerful. The sword was no longer a badly used cudgel, but a blade used with growing frequency, with grace and poise. He had raw talent, reflected Zoe, a great deal of. His mind was sharp, his memory excellent, and he was hungry to learn. He approached his reading lessons with the same focus he did his swordsmanship or magic, but there was so much for him to learn. "You always look so far away." Zoe turned, raising an eyebrow at the dragon. "Why do you say that?" "Iragan is always asking questions, always looking and wondering." The dragon opened her eyes more fully, focusing the great blue orbs on Zoe. "But you always seem to be one step removed. You see, but you are not a part of it." "I understand," said Zoe. "I suppose I am trying to understand why I am here. I am trying to unlock whatever part of me does understand." And this is the first time in my life, Sapphira, that I have time to think. The dragon kneaded the dirty with her claws, taking her time to respond. This is your world now, Zoe. You need to start living in it. Time will bring you the answers you need. The dragon did not expect a response. She turned her great head away and left Zoe to mull over her words. Glancing at Brahm and Iragan, still sparring, Zoe rose and walked away from the camp. They were still following the river and had chosen to camp among a small stand of tress that grew close to the swiftly flowing water. She turned away and walked out into the shadowed grassland. She had left her sword, taking only her bow and quiver. Absent-mindedly, her hands moving of their own accord, she pulled her bow free of the quiver and walked further into grass. Silence fell around her, the distant clanging of Brahm and Iragan's swords muffled as she moved away. The stars were beginning to appear far above her, silver lights that were slowly, one by one, being flicked on as night fell. Zoe stopped beside the last clump of scattered trees, unwilling to go too far into the featureless grassland and become disorientated. Reaching up, she pulled the bow free from the quiver and brought it around, admiring the faintly glowing weapon with its scuff marks and carefully polished but worn grip. Iragan had told her not to bother trying to use it. It was too tightly strung, he had said, and he doubted she would be able to draw the string. Zoe pulled an arrow free. She wanted to test herself. The rider knew his bows, but she had the feeling he didn't know this one. It took Zoe a minute, her movements clumsy and awkward as she tried to fit the arrow to the string correctly. She had taken several archery lessons back home, but this was nothing like those creations covered in scopes and special handholds. This bow seemed to hum underneath her hands. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Zoe raised the bow and tried to draw the string back. At first, as Iragan had said, it remained stubbornly unbent. She pulled on it hard, but it would not give. A sense of defeat rose within her. She could not use this beautiful bow. No, she thought fiercely, I won't give up. She took another breath and stilled herself. She had remembered, if that was what it was, how to use the sword because she had allowed herself to listen to some place deep inside her. Had allowed instinct, not logic, to guide her movements, allowing the sword to become an extension of her arm. Every time she had sparred since with Brahm, she had allowed herself to let go, to sink deep within herself, and she had yet to be defeated by the older man. Each time had become easier, the feeling becoming increasingly natural, and right the more she allowed herself to feel, to react, not think. Thinking took time, it dulled her reactions and made her second guess. Why should this be any different? With another deep breath, Zoe pulled the string back. She was doing it wrong, whispered an inner self. Her stance was too rigid, her arm too stiff. The string shifted, bending slightly. She would not win this battle with force. The bow would resist till the end. Allow it come back, she thought. The bow is a part of you. The string glided back, the movement graceful and sure. Her hands finding the exact placement and pressure, not forcing but not yielding either. Choosing a tree trunk as her target, Zoe focused down the shaft of the arrow and let it fly. It soared for a brief moment but fell short of its intended target. Zoe lowered her bow, a smile breaking out across her face despite the poor shot. This felt like more of an accomplishment somehow. She had to practice. In time, she thought, she would come to master this. The light had almost faded completely, and still smiling, Zoe retrieved her arrow and walked back to the small camp. She dreamed that night. She lifted the sword, the hilt comfortable in her bloodied hand. Sometimes you had to move on. You had to forgive if, for no other reason, than that any other choice would be far more devastating. She would take what was good, what was important, and move on, the past holding no more claim than that. A voice called her, low and with a rough edge that came from snapping out orders over the roar of battle. After close to 3 weeks of travel, the small group came to a small village. Darrett, Zoe later learned, was its name. It was nothing more than a small dot in the vast expanse of grassland. Not exactly a bustling metropolis, Darrett was spread out along the Nina River. Darrett looked like a small dark blob against the endless horizon. Brahm and Iragan went into the town. Sapphira, her entire body tense, remained with Zoe at a bend in the river further downstream. He will be all right, reassured Zoe. Last time I let him go into a human village. That was last time, said Zoe soothingly. This will change, said the dragon with a note of finality. He is my rider. Keep calm, said Zoe. You will put him in more danger if you rush in. What do you know of it? Said the dragon as she paced back and forth, her giant tail switching from side to side. She gazed toward the town. She looked ready to launch into the air and burn the place to the ground. Zoe was quiet for a long moment. Then, feeling as if she was speaking from very far away, she said, I know a great deal OFOF protecting those I love. The dragon swung her great head sharply to gaze at the girl, the strange tone of voice briefly distracting her. Who? I don't know, said Zoe, and her throat began to hurt, a great feeling of sadness settling somewhere inside her. I don't remember. The dragon was silent and still. I will wait this time, she said at last, but he will fly with me. The dragon was true to her word. When the horses and their riders reached Sapphira, she startled them by thrusting her head at them. The horses' back stepped nervously. Sapphira looked Eragon over carefully and then gave a low hiss. Her eyes were flinty, and the second Eragon dismounted, she swept his legs out from under him with her tail and pinned him to the ground with her talons. For a few seconds there was complete silence as Eragon and Sapphira stared at each other eye to eye, obviously arguing about something. Eragon must have said the wrong thing because she snapped her teeth by his ear. Finally Brahm asked, Well, what does she want? Eragon sighed. She wants me to ride her. He sounded less than thrilled at the prospect, a greenish hue to his face. Zoe covered her mouth with a hand to conceal the smile that crossed her face. Brahm smiled, not even bothering to cover his humor. I suppose it's about time. You do have the saddle, and it would be good for both of you to get some experience. What if something happens? I mean if you're attacked, or... Sapphira must have used his words to reinforce her point because Zoe saw Eragon wince as she tightened her talons. Go, said Zoe with what she hoped was a reassuring and not mocking smile. Brahm and I are more than capable of looking after ourselves. Tomorrow, said the dragon with a note of finality, you will fly with me tomorrow. Sapphira was good to her word. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, she rousted her rider. Eragon, looking rather green at the prospect, clambered aboard and the dragon launched herself into the air. Zoe watched them go, shading her eyes against the bright rays of the morning sun. But she turned away soon, her mind focusing on the task she had set herself. Now she needed the right moment, needed to approach the matter with delicate grace, aware that she had only recently found a fragile trust with Brahm. With a casual smile, she said lightly, he looked like he was off to his execution. Brahm quickly tied up his bedroll. He will get used to it. The man's voice was tight, his expression guarded, and Zoe turned away. She wondered, as she had many times over the past few weeks, how many times Brahm cursed the fates that had taken away his dragon and bitterly wished it was he not his son taking flight into the clear dawn air. Accepting Kadok's reins, Zoe mounted and followed Brahm. They were still traveling along the river, which had steadily widened and become larger the further they traveled. Early morning mist was rising off the water, coating everything in a thin layer of water. Zoe shivered. She appreciated the closeness of river for bathing, but she had come to despise the constant dampness. When I was young, she said into the silence, I used to read myths about ancient heroes. Zoe twisted a strand of Kadok's mane around her finger. Some of the stories weren't very pleasant, and not many of the heroes got happy endings. But many of them had a similar beginning. Brahm was looking at her. So she kept on, trying to lead him towards the real conversation, but feeling clumsy as she did so. It was annoying, without skill or grace. Most of the heroes didn't know their father, they may be suspected, but a few had no idea. They grew up in isolated mountains until someone, a god or a monster or teacher, decided to fling them out into the real world. It didn't always end well, and most of the time a person wondered if someone had just said something. She trailed off. But no one in those stories did. Some secrets are important to keep, I know that, but some just seem to get the wrong people killed. What are you getting at? Said Brahm in that gruff, demanding voice. That dwelling in the past and willingly concealing the truth does not save lives. The two were staring at each other. Unthinkingly, both had stopped their horses. Some knowledge, said Brahm with an air of finality, is too dangerous. It is distracting and harmful. His tone booked no argument. The conversation was closed. Zoe moved her horse forward, unwilling to back down now that Brahm had made such a statement, unwilling to allow him to pigeonhole it. Or withheld, the more lies and concealments. well, it leaves one open to far more devastating consequences. Is not the truth, or only half the truth, if delivered too late or by the wrong person, far, far more harmful, dangerous even? The man let out a frustrated growl, but Zoe refused to look over at him. She kept her eyes straight ahead, her back perfectly straight. This is because of those damn books, isn't it? She didn't respond. Brahm knew all he needed to about the books and the future. Besides, she thought, there was no chance of her winning an argument on the morality with the much older Brahm. I can't do what you want me to do, he said at last, and this time when Zoe glanced at him, she saw a world of regret and guilt. It made her heart lurch in sympathy and more than a little guilt. She had not intended to hurt him, but had, it seemed, in the end. Do what you think is right, said Zoe at last, knowing she could not push the issue any further, but that her words contained a far deeper meaning, a challenge, really. Part of her suspected that she had accomplished her goal, or at least warned Brahm that she would act if he did not in the end. That there was someone willing to confront him on the myriad shadows of his past, thought Zoe, may be a warning to him. Zoe stayed silent through the rest of the day, watching worriedly as Iragan and Brahm conferred over the discovery of the Razak's tracks later that afternoon and the dropped flask. She held her tongue as the two decided on their path, ignoring the occasional look that Brahm flashed her way as if daring her to say something more. And she dearly wanted to tell Iragan what the Lethblocker were, and exactly why he should shelve the whole revenge thing until he had both a better skill set and a much better idea of what real vengeance was. But she would hold her silence for now, she decided as she bit the inside of her lip. As it was, however, she didn't know how much longer she would be able to do that. Something had changed, she knew that. Something in her conversation with Brahm had begun that she could not control. 5. Chapter 6. Days melted into weeks as Brahm, Iragan, and I made our way to Term. We met more people as we drew closer to city, and eventually, Iragan was forced to wear gloves constantly to hide his Jedway Ignatia. As we encountered more people, his flying time with Saphira was also limited. This was particularly hard on Saphira, who hated having to hide and catch up with us at night. Brahm was anxious to find a horse for me, and while I did fall in love with a pretty little mare in a small town close to Term, Brahm decided she wouldn't stand up to the stress of travel and the potential fights we might get into. We had been traveling north toward the ocean for 2 days after crossing the spine when Saphira sighted Terem. However, heavy fog obscured our vision until a breeze from the west finally lifted the dense cloud. Egon gasped when Terem was suddenly revealed before us, and I was stunned silent. No city in my world looked like this one, not Paris or San Francisco or New York. Terem was like some fairy tale city that Disney had invented. The city was nestled by the edge of the sea, which stretched out to the horizon like an endless carpet of shimmering blue. Proud ships were docked with furled sails in the natural harbor. Terem took Forknux to a whole new level. The city was contained behind a white wall which was 100 feet tall and 30 feet thick, with rows of rectangular arrow slits lining it. There was a walkway on top for soldiers and watchmen, and the only break in the wall's smooth surface was 2 iron portcullises, one facing the western sea, the other opening south to the road. Above the wall, and set against its northeast section, was a huge citadel built of giant stones and turrets. In the highest tower, a lighthouse's lantern gleamed brilliantly, a beacon of safety to those at sea. I wished I had a camera for this view. Brahm turned and met my eyes. We had all agreed the night before that it would be better if I did not go into the city. I was not wearing a dress, which was just not done in this world. Along with that was the risk of being discovered by the Empire. By remaining out of the city, I would stay undetected. I wanted it to stay that way. I didn't want some guard or magician casually mentioning a strange girl with a bow and sword to someone who had the power to investigate further. Or worse, report the information to Durza or the Razak, who would then take it to the king. Quickly, I slipped off Snowfer and grabbed Kadok's reins. I looked up into Aragan's face. Look, I whispered. When you're in Tem, you might be tempted to eavesdrop. If you just remember that the person you hear has your best interests at heart. They aren't keeping things from you to harm you, but because it isn't the right time to tell it to you. Iragan nodded, looking confused, but managed not to interrupt. Another thing to keep in mind is to pay special attention to the advice you are given. It might be important later on. Iragan gave me another funny look and was about to ask a question when I turned away and bid Brahm goodbye. We had discovered a cave that was within walking distance of Terim, but far enough away that no one should discover it. Saphira could also fit inside, which, considering how big she was getting, was remarkable. I slipped off the path with my bow drawn and an arrow fixed to the string, just in case. It did not take long to reach the mossy cliff. The cliff was surrounded by maples, and it felt very peaceful. The sunlight shimmered on the green leaves that rustled in the slight breeze. I turned my attention from the trees to the cliff in front of me. In the book, Iragan had first chosen a path that got him stuck halfway up. With no Saphira to rescue me, if I did get stuck, I had to search the base for a better route. All the time I looked, I was aware of my surroundings and searching for any potential threats with both my mind and my senses. I finally found the path about 3 feet to right of the obvious one that Iragan had taken in the book. I checked that my weapons were secure and began to climb, relishing the physical exercise. When I first arrived in Alagaesia, I could not have climbed the cliff. I was used to a life of relatively no physical activity when compared to the kind that of life that people in this world led. However, 2 months of riding, sparing and hunting had made me fit and strong. When I reached the mouth of the cave, I was sweaty and hot. As I caught my breath, I looked cave. The back of the cave was lost in shadow, and I found the mines of a colony of bats that roosted in it. I turned and looked out to the east. The cliff provided a wonderful view of the surroundings, especially the sea which roared and thundered in the distance. I wondered what Iragan and Brahm were up to. Had they met Jowd yet? How big were Iragan's eyes as he visited his first major city? I smiled at the thought of all the questions Iragan must have about Term and what old friend of Brahm's they were going to be visiting. Slowly, I sat down and rested my back against the rough stone of the cave. I drew my knees up to my chest, and slowly my body began to relax, and all the tension eased out of me as I observed the landscape. A sense of peace filled me, and I thought about all that happened since my arrival in Alagaesia. I had no time to just think about all the things I had learned, seen, and done. I welcomed the chance to just think about it, with no one around to ask me questions or see the emotions I had kept bottled up for the last few weeks. A gentle breeze stirred my hair, and I leaned my head against the rough stone, with my knees drawn up to my chest. Slowly, an image of a place that was very similar to the one I was viewing on the cliff flickered across my vision like a ghost of memory. I was looking out towards an ocean and a black mass of swirling clouds. A boy, his face obscured in shadow, was standing next to me. I turned to ask him a question, desperate to find out more about what was happening, but before I could speak, the image faded away. I was left staring at Term and the vast expanse of water that stretched to the horizon. I felt depressed and certain of only one thing. I knew that boy, but I also knew that I had never seen him again after that moment on the cliff. His name flickered on the edge of my memory, but the more I thought about it, the less I was certain I did know it. What was happening to me? We spent 3 days at Terem. During that time, I never strayed far from the cliff. Saphira and I became fast friends. I even told her about my old life in America. Talking with Saphira was both funny and intellectually challenging. She saw the world in such a different light, but at the same time, we shared many similar opinions about everything from Iragan's training to the best way to cook rabbit. Iragan spent most of the time in the city, immersed in Jowd's library with Brahm, who was using the trip as an excuse to improve Iragan's history and battle tactics. He mentioned his visit to Angela, but I didn't ask for any details, and he didn't give any. The time Iragan spent in Term was difficult for Saphira, who longed for the day when she and Ergyang could again fly, without having to worry about being seen. Finally, on the morning of the 4th day, I saw 2 familiar figures riding towards the cliff, and a few minutes later I sensed both Ergyang's and Brahm's minds. Saphira was tense, her eyes never leaving Iragan and Brahm, as though she thought they would vanish if she so much as blinked. I rested my right hand on her side as we both waited for the 2 riders to draw closer. When they were only a few minutes' walk from the cliff, I smiled at the blue dragon. I will see you later, Spahira. Safe travels, Zoe, said Saphira. I embraced her tightly around the neck, and then I readjusted my quiver before quickly climbing down the cliff face. I paused at the bottom just in case there was someone hidden in the bushes waiting for me or watching my companions. Call me paranoid, but I think I have good reason, before running towards meet Brahm and Iragan. I was surprised to see that Brahm was leading a grey mare. She was a steel grey with a white star in the middle of her forehead. She was very refined, and her black mane was long and thick. I realized that he must have found her for me tame, and I just stopped and stared at the beauty. Brahm smiled. Well, what do you think? I didn't say anything for a moment as I gazed at my very first horse. Finally, I managed to say, she's perfect, Brahm. Thank you so much. Brahm laughed and passed me the reins. I stroked the glossy neck of the mare and offered her a piece of apple from my pocket. What will you name her? Asked Iragan from Kadok. I stared at the mare thinking, what about Mellinger? I smiled slightly as the mare nudged me in the stomach with her soft nose. Mellinger had been a horse from the Chronicles of Prydain, one of my favorite series of books when I was growing up. Mellinger it is, said Brahm. I quickly sorted my belongings into the saddle bags before mounting. She pranced, eager to be gone, and on to whatever adventure was waiting for us. Where are we going now? I asked Brahm as we began to trot away from Tam. Mellinger's head was up, and her ears kept flicking back and forth. We are planning on going to Drasleona and Helgrund, but I suppose you already knew that. Brahm gave me a very stern frown. I did, but before you start asking questions, I glared at Iragan and was about to speak. I did not tell you because I don't want to change too many things. You will just have to trust my judgment. Brahm grunted, and Iragan opened his mouth again, but I quickly interrupted and asked Brahm a question about the verb charts in the ancient language. I was reluctant to get into the whole confusing business of changing the future, especially with these two. Night was just beginning to fall when we stopped for the day. Iragan left for water while Brahm prepared to light a campfire. I quickly caught his wrist and shook my head. No, Brahm, we might need to leave in a hurry tonight. In fact, I think I might leave Mellinger saddled. Brahm sighed and threw his hands up in the hair in exasperation. Will you explain this to me? I bit my lower lip, but before I could speak Saphira growled, and suddenly I was lying in the dirt with one of her talons wrapped around my waist. Brahm was pinned in her right claw. The air was knocked out of me, and I lay there gasping while Saphira crouched over top. Finally, I managed to gasp, Saphira, would you let me go? Saphira just growled at me and refused to answer me or let me go. I heard Iragan enter the camp just as I was beginning to wonder if he would ever get here before the next ice age. Stop, it's me, yelled Iragan. Right, I thought sarcastically, we know that. What would be nice is if you get your overprotective dragon off me. Oops, Iragan snapped, you could have killed me. Where are Brahm and Zoe? We are right here, snapped Brahm. Tell your crazy dragon to release us. She won't listen to me. Let them go, said Iragan, sounding completely exasperated. Didn't you tell him? Saphira lifted her claws from me, and I warily got up, rubbing my right shoulder, which was sore from the impact. Before Urgyang could say anything more, I snapped in my most venomous voice. Let me guess you found an Urgle footprint, and it's fresh. Iragan stared at me with an amazed expression. Yes, he said, his mouth hanging open. I rolled my eyes and hurried to untie Mellinger. Brahm quickly saddled Snowfire, cursing under his breath the entire time. I was just about to mount when I remembered Iragan and his broken wrist. Everything was going wrong tonight. Iragan's face was pale, and he held his right arm close to his chest. Brahm had also noticed Iragan and said tightly, "What's wrong with your arm?" Iragan gestured at his broken wrist with his left hand and said, "My wrist is broken." Brahm cursed again and saddled Kadok before helping Iragan mount. Tell Saphira to fly above us. The Urgles will think twice before attacking if she is there. Iragan nodded, and I quickly mounted up. Mellinger danced on the spot, and when I loosed the reins, she took off like a shot down the trail. We rode hard for about an hour before I heard the sounds of horns behind me. They were cold and harsh. Brahm pulled Snowfur up and spoke. They've found our campsite. Iragan, you ride Saphira. You're useless with your arm, and if something happens to us, you must not land. As if Iragan was going to remember that piece of advice. When Iragan was in the air, Brahm gave me a hard look. You can look after yourself, Zoe, but promise me that you will help Iragan if I don't make it through this night. I nodded, and in the ancient language I said, I promised to help him to the best of my abilities. Brahm relaxed slightly and then said, "Then let's go. Try to stay close to me." With that, we took off down the trail. We had not gone 20 feet when I felt the twisted consciousnesses of Urgles, or what had to be Urgles. Dropping my reins on Mellinger's neck, I quickly slipped an arrow to my bow string and held it at the ready. I could not see Brahm ahead of me for the darkness was too deep, but I could feel the Urgles drawing closer. It was then that I felt an Urgle's consciousness to my left. I panicked as I realized that they must have planned an ambush, but they didn't in the book. What was happening? I managed to get myself under control, and I whipped my bow up and fired. I heard a muffled grunt, and then thud as my arrow found its target in the Urgle. I slipped my bow onto my back and drew my sword. The familiar blade gave me courage as another Urgle leapt in front of me, club raised, and I only saw his face briefly before I slammed his club aside with my sword and stabbed my sword through his heart. The image of his black horns and crazed eyes would haunt my dreams for many nights afterwards. However, there was no lingering, for Mellinger lunged forward as soon as the Urgle fell, and we galloped down the path. I could not see Brahm, and it was too dark for me to see hoof prints. Suddenly the road split. One fork went right, and the other left. Without pausing or checking her stride, Melinaga took the right fork, which seemed to lead towards the sea. I briefly wondered if this was the right choice, but it was too late, and I could hear the Urgle's horns behind me. My blood pumped in my ears, and I was running on pure adrenaline, and yes, I was terrified. After what seemed ages, the trees cleared, and I found myself on a bare hill that overlooked the ocean and Terim far behind with its lighthouse. I could just see the light of the lighthouse, but it was just a small pinprick against the black sky. The Urgles were about to get ambushed by that idiot rider. He needed to learn this lesson, but I still berated myself for being so stupid as to get separated from Brahm. I searched the area with my thoughts, but there were no Urgles or humans close by. I sighed with relief and trotted Mellinger down the trail. I kept my sword out, and I was just waiting for the next attack. I hated how dark and frightening the shadows looked. It was like a blanket had been thrown over the world. Finally, just as the eastern sky was growing light, I came out of the trees and onto a bluff overlooking the sea. I turned and looked behind me. The forest spread out to my left, and the sea was to my right. The trail followed the edge of the bluff, and from what I could see it remained out of the trees. I sighed. There was no Urgle or human close enough for me to sense, but I had no way of contacting Brahm. There were still Urgles running about the countryside, so I doubted that staying in one place would be the best choice. "Damn, what have you gotten yourself into, Zoe?" I nudged Mellinger forward into a trot. Her hoofbeats were soft and rhythmical on the soft dirt of the trail. I watched the trees to my left for any sign of movement. All of a sudden I felt the twisted mind of an Urgle to my left. I whipped my sword up and blocked his club just as it came down. Had I not got my sword up in time, I would have been killed right then and there. Mellinger spun and reared as the Urgle, and I dueled briefly. However, I managed to disarm him, and with a slash I ended the Urgle's life. His blood splashed all over my sword, and I felt the urge to throw up. Mellinger jumped forward and galloped down the trail. After a few minutes I slowed her down and wiped the blood from my sword. I searched the area with my mind feeling like a cornered rabbit. 3 Urgles were coming my way, and they would be here soon. I slipped my sword into its sheath and drew my bow, fixing it on the place where the Urgles would appear. The broad chest of the first Urgle appeared in the trees, and without pausing I fired my bow. The arrow found its mark in the Urgle's neck, and then just as fast I reloaded and fired at the 2 Urgles who had yet to sense the danger. I felt their consciousness flicker out like a candle flame, and I lowered my bow. I threw up then, and there over my mare's side. The Urgles were not monsters, but it was easier to think of them that way, especially when you had to kill them. It was a fine line to walk. The morning continued uneventfully, though I never lowered my guard, and I kept Mellinger in either a slow trot or a fast walk. Finally, at midday, I came to a stream. The water was clear and very cold. I dismounted and let my mare drink her fill. I was weary and covered in grime, but I didn't feel safe enough to stop for a bath. My plan was to continue on to Dras Leona and if I was lucky I would meet up with Eragon and Bram there. The name of the inn they would stay at was the Green Chestnut, if I remembered correctly. I remounted and continued on, feeling slightly more hopeful. I was not helpless, and neither was I completely lost. I could find my way back to Eragon and Bram, or at least I could follow the trouble they caused. Bram rubbed his aching temples. It wasn't surprising that he had a crashing headache after last night. Not only was Eragon unconscious, but Zoe was lost, potentially dead or injured, and he was hunting Urgles. Could it get any worse? Saphira turned her head and met his eyes. Where do you want to go, Bram? There are no Urgles close to us. There is a group of Urgles heading east, or at least that was the last place I sensed them. Saphira angled her flight in the general direction of the ocean. With a sigh, Bram leaned against his head against Saphira's warm scales and allowed himself to relax. The last few hours had been stressful in the extreme, and it would continue to be stressful until the last of the Urgles were dead and he had found Zoe. Eragon was still out like a light and probably would remain that way for the next few days. He had been a fool, and Bram a bigger one, not to spend more time drilling him in using his power wisely. Then there was Zoe, who somehow during the night had become separated from him. She was more than capable of looking after herself, but he was worried for her. Despite how easily she outmatched both he and Eragon in her speed and strength, she was young and unfamiliar with Alagaesia. She, unlike Eragon, was more than capable of thinking clearly in a dangerous situation. Added to the problem was when he should tell Eragon the truth about his family, though that would have to wait until he forged some sense into the boy's brain. Saphira began to circle the trees where they suspected the Urgles may be hiding, but Bram could not sense their minds. What do you think, Bram? Should I land and you can search the area? It was hard for Bram to be connected to Saphira. It reminded him too much of his own dead dragon. Yes. Do you see that trail that follows the bluff? Land there. You should be able to see to the north and south without anything being able to sneak up on you from behind. Saphira opened her wings and landed on the hard, dry ground. Bram slowly dismounted and drew his sword, watching carefully for any signs of movement. He was just about to enter the trees when he spotted the first dead Urgle. It was lying on its back with an arrow through its throat. Two others lay beside it. All of them had been shot with the same type of arrow. It was then that he realized that the arrows looked exactly like Zoe's. Saphira snaked her head around Bram and examined the bodies. Those are Zoe's arrows. She passed this way a couple of hours ago. The dragon prepared herself to fly, ready to find their lost companion as soon as possible. Bram rested a hand on her shoulder. The dragon paused and turned her head to look at him. Her dark blue eyes were full of impatient anxiety. Indeed, Saphira, but it also means that she would have kept going rather than wait for another group of Urgles to attack her. These have been dead at least 6 hours. She could be miles away by now, and this trail will lead her into a more heavily populated area. You and I cannot search for her without drawing attention to ourselves. We cannot allow her to continue when she has no idea of where we are going. Saphira snapped her jaws angrily. Bram remembered his dragon doing exactly the same thing when she had been frustrated. He felt a stab of pain at the memory. You would have thought he had gotten used to the pain and the loneliness, but no, he never had. Never would probably. Zoe knows where we are going, Saphira. You know that as well as I, it was she who started us in the right direction by telling us of the connection with the oil, and she knows things that many who were born in Alagaesia do not. It would not be difficult for her to get directions to Dras Leona, and in some ways she is better prepared for this world than even I. Her swordsmanship rivals even the elves, and she thinks clearly and logically. Still, is there nothing we can do? Yes, we can finish hunting these Urgles before they begin hunting her, but beyond that we will just have to keep an eye out for her on the way to Dras Leona. If we are lucky, we will meet her on the road or in the city, or at least he hoped they would. He did not want another death on his consciousness. 6. Travel. Bram's strict training filled nearly every hour as the days slowly blended into weeks. Sparring, memorizing, history, and thinking clearly in battle were all prominently featured topics that took up most, if not all, of Eragon's waking moments. However, in the brief breaks or the times he found himself lying awake and gazing at the stars, Eragon found himself missing Zoe more and more. He missed reading with her, sparring, learning from Bram with her, and practicing the ancient language during the evening. She had been an addition to his life he hadn't fully appreciated until she was gone. Was it her open wonder at his tacking skills? Was it her wry sense of humor? Or was it, simply, her steady presence in a world that seemed to be constantly shifting before him? He tried to tell himself in those moments that she would make it. They would see each other in Dras Leona and continue on from there. He tried, like anyone would in his position, not to think about the very real possibility that Zoe would not make it to Dras Leona. They had seen no sign of her along the road, and while Brahm thought she might travel further down the coast and then cross the mountains, it was only a guess. The old man, if he felt any worry for their companion, did not speak of it, and the topic went undiscussed between father and son. Because of the splint on his right hand, which he had earned during his ill-conceived fight with the Urgles, Eragon was forced to use his left hand when he sparred and practiced his writing. Before long, he could duel as well with his left hand as he could with his right, the challenge of it proving to be just what he needed to keep his thoughts off Zoe. Writing with his left hand, however, proved to be a far sight more difficult than he had originally imagined it could be. He just never could get his hand to do what he wanted it to, and it amused Saphira endlessly. The letters would turn out spiky and larger than he wanted. Eventually, he gave up on it, for the task seemed maddeningly frustrating. And through this, they kept on traveling. Following the swift-flowing Torak River southeast, along the edge of the spine they watched as the river grew in size, as tributaries flowed into it from every side, feeding its bulging girth. Along the river, towns and villages began to spring up, and they had to be careful about concealing their identities, a task made more difficult for Eragon because of the posters which featured his face in every single village, no matter how small it was. When the river was over a league wide, Brahm pointed at the silt islands that dotted the water. "We're close to Leona Lake now," he said. "It's only about 2 leagues away." "Do you think we can get there before nightfall?" asked Eragon. "We can try." Dusk soon made the trail hard to follow, but the sound of the river on their side guided them, and when the moon rose, the bright disk provided enough light to see what lay ahead. The sight would stay with Eragon for his whole life. It was not the first lake he had seen, for there had been many beautiful ones hidden within the steep valleys of the spine, but it was the largest, and in the silver moonlight, it was the most enchanting. Leona Lake looked like a thin sheet of silver beaten over the land. Aside from a bright strip of moonlight reflecting off the surface, it was indistinguishable from the ground. He wondered, with an inner laugh, if he ran down to it, if he would be able to run across it as if it were solid and not liquid. Saphira was on the rocky shore, fanning her wings to dry them. Her scales reflected the glittering water, and she seemed even more beautiful than usual to his eyes. Eragon greeted her, and she said, "The water is lovely deep, cool and clear. Maybe I'll go swimming tomorrow." In an effort to joke, he said to her, "Remember how Zoe was always going on about being clean?" "Yes, and she had a point. You do smell rather unfortunate." Eragon shook his head at his dragon, and they set up camp under a stand of trees. For once, Brahm did not pull out the sword and challenge Eragon to a spar, and they ate in silence, both lost in thought. Eragon was just preparing to sleep when he asked Saphira, "Yes, little one, do you think we will see Zoe again?" Saphira blew a puff of smoke over Eragon's head and said, "I think we will." Zoe would not allow anything to come in between her and accomplishing her goals. "Have some faith, little one." Eragon sighed, but he was too tired to think too long on the matter, and in a few minutes he was soon asleep. He fell asleep looking up at the stars, and imaging that, in the dark space between the glimmering orbs, he could see the softly smiling face of one of his dearest friends. I had arrived at a crossroads. Trees and dense vegetation surrounded me, and the trail was just wide enough for a wagon or carriage. It was not that I did not know what route to take, it was the left one, but that it was currently blocked by a rather odd and eccentric-looking middle-aged woman and a boy of about 12. She was standing in the middle of the road, as if considering what route to take, and I was just about to try and move Melinlas around her when she turned and gave me a brilliant smile. The sight of her made me gasp in shock and sudden recognition. The woman's clothes were travel-worn, but they looked to be of good quality. She had a sword was hanging from her hip and a traveling pack on her shoulders. With her wildly curling hair and the mischievous glint in her eyes, she was quite striking if slightly frightening. This was Angela the herbalist, and of course, The young boy standing beside her with a feral grin upon his face was really not a boy at all. That was, in fact, Salimbum the werecat. Her mind was guarded by walls of iron, and there was an inexplicable feeling of power, of strength, and of mystery that hung around her. "A fellow traveler, I presume?" asked Angela in a cheery voice. Had I not known that Salimbum was actually a werecat, I would have thought he was just a young boy. His feral grin was unnerving, and it put me on my guard. I knew just how dangerous the herbalist and the werecat were. What if she found out who I was? In my time traveling alone, I had quickly grown accustomed to evading questions, patrols of Empire soldiers, the occasional merchant caravan, and any villagers I encountered. But Angela would be a hard one to fool. I was still riding along the coast, and would soon have to cross the mountains, which would then drop me down to Leona Lake. As I had traveled, spring had come to Alagaesia, sooner to the coast, where most of the precipitation came as rain, not snow. Melinla's had enjoyed searching for the little bits of green grass that were starting to poke through, and her coat was beginning to lose its rough, winter length as her silky summer one came in. Because the road I followed ran so close to the sea, I even took my mare for a canter down the soft, sandy beaches and satisfied an old-time childhood whim. I had also enjoyed the milder weather. It became easier to find edible berries and roots, but the downfall was the cold rain that would occasionally be blown in from the sea and drench everything with cold water. When the squalls would become too unbearable to travel in, I was forced to stop and find a somewhat dry camping space in a clump of trees or under an overhang of rock. Since being separated from Brahm and Iragan, I traveled mainly by night, depending on how busy the trail was. I had rather enjoyed the silence and the chance to perfect my archery and hunting skills, but there were times when the loneliness grew unbearable. I missed Iragan's constant questions, Brahm's lessons, and Saphira's company, but I had no choice but to grow used to nothing more than the company of my horse and my own thoughts. According to the merchant I had spoken with and bartered for a new cloak from, when I dropped down to the lake, I would need to take the ferry across the lake. Apparently it came every other day, and it was usually used by merchants and the occasional traveler coming from the coast. I would have to pass through a small village and use a few of my gold coins for passage, but it was faster than traveling around the lake, which would take upwards of 3 to 4 weeks of hard riding. From my current location, I had guessed that I must be just a few weeks' travel from Brahm's old village of Cuesta that was just a little further up the coast. But I was currently at a crossroads and facing a very difficult-to-fool wielder of magic. "I am," I said simply. With a little bit of luck, Angela would not demand better responses. It was a feeble hope. "Well, what is your destination?" asked Angela impatiently. Her eyes took in my clothes and the black cloak that I had pulled around to cover my sword. I was silent for a moment, considering my answer before saying with a shrug, "I had thought of journeying to Leona, but that is subject to change. I go where the winds blow and there is a chance of adventure. What about you and your companion?" Melinla's shifted underneath me, and I hoped that by twisting the question back to the herbalist I could escape without having to go into all the details. Salimbum was staring at me, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew I was withholding a great deal. It felt as if the werecat stripped away all my armor and exposed all my secrets with just one look. It was unsettling, very unsettling, and I could not wait to escape this claustrophobic clearing where the road divided. Angela smiled cheerily. "I am of the same mindset when it comes to travel. Where the wind goes, an adventure is sure to be found." Twirling one of her many scarves around a finger, she asked, "Why, in the name of fluffy hedgehogs, are you thinking of traveling to that city? It is hardly a pleasant vacation destination unless you want to visit their monument to evil and see all the worst kind of people." Angela gave me a serious look, and I could not help but inwardly agree with her. If I had a choice, I would not travel to Leona. However, it wasn't as if I had much of one. Iragan and Brahm were going there. I shrugged again, as if to say, "It is so unfortunate, isn't it?" With a casual smile, I said out loud, "I agree with you, but unfortunately I was hoping to meet with some old friends and leave as soon as I could." It was then, to my surprise, that Angela stepped forward suddenly and took Melinla's reins in one hand to hold her still. My hand unconsciously slipped to my sword hilt, and I automatically felt myself prepare to fight. But the herbalist just shook her head and said in a quiet voice that I had leaned down to hear, "You really think I don't know who you are?" Her eyes burned with intensity as they met my own, and I was frozen in place by them, unable to move or look away. "Your arrival sent shockwaves throughout the very fabric of the world. You are lucky that that accursed king isn't in touch with the land, or else he would have flown out on his dragon looking for you." She rested one hand over mine, and the touch sent shivers through me as she continued, "I can see the mark of power on you. Use that power wisely, girl. For you, Zoe, is someone who has been cursed or gifted, if you want to look at it that way, with knowledge of the future. You had better not destroy the world with your meddling, for if you do then you will answer to me." The look that she gave me chilled me to my bones, and her hand tightened around my own until it hurt. I realized, quite suddenly, that the books really hadn't explained to readers just how dangerous the herbalist really was. Angela was many things, but she kept it hidden under a mask of eccentricity and odd habits. She could destroy me with a snap of her fingers. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if she could destroy Galaptorix just as easily if she really put her mind to it. I gathered me courage, and somehow managed to find my voice which had temporarily deserted me. Softly, my voice unsure and sounding so young to my ears, I did my best to put words to my feelings. "I understand all too well. I can only hope that my choices and my very arrival have not changed things irrevocably. Can you tell me why I was sent to this land?" I felt a bit of desperate hope. Maybe Angela would have answers for me. Just maybe. I waited with bated breath. The herbalist shook her head and gave a small laugh as if the question amused her. "No, your purpose has yet to be discovered. Remember, Zoe, that sometimes people have to die. You can't always save them." I felt a cold chill grow within me, and her next words did nothing to ease it. "Perhaps there is hope for you after all. You seem a great deal clearer-headed and refined than that rider. Now off you go. We haven't all day." Before I could respond, she gave Melanlas a smack on her rump, and my mare bolted away, all too eager to leave the herbalist and her odd companion behind. By the time I got her back under control, Angela and Salimbum were far behind, and I had no doubt that if I returned to the crossroads, they would be gone. They seemed to have been waiting for me, as if Angela had known the road I chose to take and how quickly I would travel upon it. Sometimes people have to die. What had she meant by that? Iragan was right. The herbalist seemed to leave you with more questions than answers. It was as though she purposely enjoyed making you feel lost in a wilderness of possible meanings and ambiguous statements. I clucked Melanlas into a trot and tried to keep my thoughts occupied on other, less troubling, thoughts, but to avail. I kept thinking about Angela and her words. Did she know that Brahm would die saving Iragan? Probably, for, after all, Angela was a true seer. She must have guessed that I would plan on rescuing him and decided to warn me against changing what had to be. Or was that not what she had meant? Had she been talking of other lives, other people who I could not save? It was giving me a headache. Alagaesia in general gave me a headache. I was so preoccupied with my thoughts that 3 days of travel passed without me really being aware of my surroundings. That was a foolish mistake on my part. It was my distraction that proved instrumental in my near capture. I had forgotten just how dangerous this world was, and how even a simple mistake can lead to either your death or your capture. I was no longer just a simple American girl, but a potential enemy to a mad king who had no qualms about killing anyone who threatened his position. In my isolation from the world, and the quiet weeks of travel that had gone by so peacefully, I had forgotten. This was no fairy tale in which you woke up or were saved by a knight in shining armor before you got killed. I had just passed through the mountain pass and was about 3 days from Leona Lake when I chose a camp in a small hollow after a long night of travel. It was well sheltered, but I did not search with my mind to see if there was anyone camped close by. Instead, I unsaddled my mare and sat down on the hard, dry ground while Melanlas ate some of the sparse grass that grew between the gnarled trees. While I sat there, I played with stick as I considered my options, along with the very real possibility of destroying everything because of my meddling. I was weary, but sleep refused to find me easily, and any that I had found was so restless that it really wasn't like sleep at all. I was also thinking of the sudden disappearance of my visions. I had not had one since separating from Brahm and Iragan, and it both troubled and comforted me. Why had they suddenly stopped coming? It was as if something about Brahm and Iragan triggered them, or maybe it had nothing to do with my friends. I didn't know what to think or do about anything. All I knew was I no longer saw those vivid images, and there were no more equally vivid dreams. Melanlas was standing a little ways away grazing, and the sky was just beginning to lighten to the east. A warm breeze ruffled my hair, and I leaned back against a tree, feeling the tension slowly leave my shoulders. It would be nice to be back with the others, to have their company distract me from these never-ending questions which I had, currently, too much time to think about. There was a sudden snap. The noise was so sudden and unexpected that I jumped, and my mare spooked, her head flying up as she flared her nostrils. Suddenly, I was on high alert, and every single horror story I had ever read started playing through my mind, along with the very real possibility that I was about to be attacked. I stretched my mind out and realized, to my horror, that there was a group of 3 slavers watching me. I could sense their evil intentions, the unspeakable things they would like to do to me, and I almost, not quite but almost, screamed out for help. I mastered my panic, horror and anger at my stupidity. Adrenaline was beginning to course through my veins, and it made it suddenly easier to think and to act as I had to. I rose, careful not to make a noise, and slipped my sword from its sheath. The well-oiled blade did not make a sound as it slid free and settled comfortingly in my hand. Just holding it made me feel more confident, and it seemed to sharpen my senses. It was then that the men acted, for they had realized that I was aware of them. And so began my very first true fight with people of my own race. They lunged from the shadows with their blades drawn. I whipped my sword up and engaged them. From the brief glimpses I got of their minds, I could feel their surprise and shock at my skill. They suddenly realized that attacking me was maybe not the greatest idea. But it was too late for them to back out, and despite their shock, they were fairly certain that they could overpower me if they fought their hardest. As we exchanged blows, I came to find that their movements were slow and clumsy, though they made up for it with brute strength and the simple fact that outnumbered me. The slavers used their swords like clubs, while I was more used to more flow and grace, where the true danger lay in being outthought by a clever opponent. However, this was no sparring match, but rather my first true fight, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. As I fought, my mind went on autopilot. Parry, lunge, twirl, jab, back, and then forward. Dead. On to the next. I killed my first man without realizing it until I nearly tripped over him. It was an amateur mistake, and had I been facing a truly skilled opponent, they would have disarmed me then and there. But I was so focused, so intent on the movements and the fighting that I had, unconsciously, not realized it, and shock nearly made me drop my sword. Some part of me, the part fueled by adrenaline that had not gone numb by this terrifying act, made my body back up quickly, which saved me from being beheaded. That part of my brain made my body continue the fight. For in such a situation, there is no time for stopping or considering what just happened. It is after the fight that you look back and sometimes throw up or burst into tears, or well, you get the idea. There is no time in between for trying to digest everything that just happened. On to the next. I want to be sick. The rest of the fight went by in a blur of jabs, lunges, and parries. It was only when I stood panting in the middle of the clearing that I realized my sword was bloody. The 3 scruffy men were dead in front of me, and that the fight was over. It was over. I felt sick, and I could not tear my eyes away from the 3 bodies. I had killed. What have I done? I thought to myself. They may have had families, and while they had been thinking of doing some rather unspeakable things to me, it still felt wrong, horribly wrong, to have killed them. It didn't matter that I had acted in self-defense. I had killed, and it seemed as if some part of me had been broken. My rose-tinted glasses were shattered, and I saw the world with clear eyes. It was not a pretty world, in fact, it was cruel and ruthless. I had known this, but it felt as if the message had just been driven home. It was as though someone had dumped a bucket of icy water on me. I had convinced myself that I would never have to deal with something like this. Somehow I had, and allowed myself to be caught up in an adventure. I had conveniently forgotten the fact that I would have to kill other people. I had been a romantic fool to think that this would not be part of following Iragan around. I would go to war. I would kill again and again. This was what I had signed myself up for, and I had conveniently forgotten it in the weeks of travel, the fun times, the laughter, the slowly growing friendship between us, and the isolation that the wild landscape provided from such hard truths. I suddenly realized that this is how soldiers must feel, why they come home so changed. I gazed at my blood-stained blade, and finally, I just sat down and stared at my hands. A distant part of me urged me to leave before anyone found me, but I felt numb. It was then that the soft muzzle of Melinla's nudged me. The mare blew in my face and nudged me again. A bit of life came back to me, and I rose. My motions felt mechanical, and I avoided looking at the dead bodies. Instead, I cleaned my sword on some grass and saddled my mare. I could not go home now. I had changed so much, and after all of this, could I ever face my ordinary parents after this? Could I look them in the face and say, I learned how to fight with a sword, fire a bow, defend my mind, and I have killed? No, no, I probably couldn't. I forced myself to examine the reasons behind my actions as I walked Melinla's down the trail. Were they good enough? Yes, they actually were, and deep down I knew they were. Would I have do this kind of thing again? Yes. Could I live with it? Maybe. No, scratch that. I could if I did it in self-defense and because it was my last option. What was I fighting for? Was it good enough? Yes, it was. I was fighting for the freedom of Alagaesia and for the slim chance of returning home to my family. I was fighting because Iragan was my friend, and he needed all the help I could give him. I twisted Melinla's mane around my fingers and leaned against her as she walked down the trail, walking away from the dead bodies of the slavers. The thought that kept bugging me was not the typical one of, did I enjoy killing that most ask themselves over and over? My answer to that question was no, 1,000 times, underlined and capitalized until people got the point. It was another, maybe cliché, but just as important one. Why me? Why a girl from Earth? Why a typical teenager whose biggest problems was her family and not an entire country of thousands of innocent bystanders? Stopping Melinla's, I mounted my mare and nudged her into a trot. I was tired, but there was no way I was stopping after what had just happened. As I rode, a chilling thought suddenly struck me. This wasn't the first time I had killed. Far from it. I felt as if there were memories just beyond my reach, and I felt glad that they were, for I didn't know if I could live with myself if I remembered some of them. This wasn't the first time I had been caught up in a war. This wasn't the first time I had to choose between killing and being killed. It was a chilling realization. It was terrifying to suddenly realize that I didn't actually know all the things stored in my head or all the things I had done. The realization was more terrifying than even facing Urgles or fighting the men had been. I was suddenly and so completely relieved that there was a wall between what I was now and who I had been. I could only hope that it would stay there until I was ready to deal with it. The truth of it might just be the hardest thing I would ever face. I made myself a promise, then, as I rode towards Drasleona. The sun was just peeking over the horizon and sending rays of bright sunshine out over the land. The light was a welcomed sight, and the old line of everything looks better in the sunlight rang true. My adrenaline, still pumping through me, made everything seem clearer and brighter, as if it had all been put through Photoshop and had the color increased. I raised my face to the sky and smiled slightly, soaking up the sun and grateful for the simple pleasure of seeing the light again after what felt like complete darkness. I would save Brahm because I loved him. I would do my best to make sure he lived because he didn't deserve the death that awaited him. Killing the slave traders that had attacked me had shocked me back into reality and out of the negative tailspin I had been unknowingly caught in. It had me realize that I could not live with myself if I failed to save the old, grumpy man that was so many things to so many people. That was so much to me. As I rounded a bend in the road, I caught sight of Leona Lake glittering in the distance, and I clucked Melinla's forward into a canter. I was filled with renewed determination. I would become who I was meant to be and discover who I used to be. It was better to know. Better know who I was than not know at all. 7. Drasleona. I was in a foul mood. No, I am in a bad mood. It had been one of those mornings when everything was irritating, from the boatman to the dratted city of Drasleona to the haunting fears that refused to leave me behind. If I could, I would have relaxed in a comfortable chair after a long bath, drank some tea, and vented to a good friend. That would have made it all better. But I couldn't, because guess what? I was stuck in a world where none of that was currently possible. I should backtrack. I am leaving you in the dust, and I don't mean to. It had started with the boatman. My day had started off pleasant enough. I had arrived in time to catch the ferry, but the boatman had been less than keen to allow a strange girl and her horse onto his precious boat. You would have thought the little bit of rickety wooden floating object was made from precious gold, the way he was treating it. Finally, I lost my patience and slipped into his mind and influenced his thoughts. I nearly drew my sword and threatened him, but I managed to restrain myself, just managed to. The entire thing gave me a crashing headache that was made worse by the hot sun. Then this blasted city. I know, my mother told me hate is a strong word and should not be used lightly, but you have never seen Drasleona, and if you have, then I offer you my deepest condolences. To those of you who have stood in its shadow, walked its narrow streets, or looked up at its church, then you know what I am talking about. You know why I say with complete conviction that I hate this place. The city just radiates an aura of evil, fear, and desperation. After so long with only my mare for company, it was loud, smelly, and ugly beyond belief. It made me realize how much I love the modern cities of my world: New York, Boston, San Francisco, or Paris. All of these cities were beautiful, elegant, and busy in the right ways. Yes, they had places you didn't go, but they were fun to explore and full of things to do. If you weren't an idiot, then you would be okay. From this city, I had the feeling that it didn't matter if you were an idiot or not. You could still end up dead. But Drasleona, none of that here. Even the name is terrible. I was beginning to wish I had just followed Angela's advice and skipped the place entirely, but no, I couldn't. Ah, I had to be here, and it was only because of them, because they were my friends, that I didn't turn my mare away and point her towards the Bear Mountains and the Varden. However, of course, I couldn't, and I have to go over those reasons so many times inside my head that you must be sick and tired of it. I slipped inside the main wall with a group of merchants, and as I made my way towards the center of the city, the more uneasy I became. Hungry eyes watched me from the alleys in between the narrow houses. Hawkers lingered on every corner, and anybody on the street seemed to be in a constant rush to get somewhere, as if lingering in the streets was ill-advised. No one paid me any attention, as if the sight of another ragged traveler with a dark hood covering their face was nothing to be bothered about. My hands never loosened their tight grip around Melanles's reins, and as I stood waiting at a crossroads for some carriages to pass by, I decided to leave the city. There was no way I was planning on spending even a single night with those cathedral spires looming over top of me. Why should I put up with this place when I could be free of it? I was used to camping out in the wild after so long of it, and while a real bed sounded lovely, I hardly wanted one infested with lice or fleas. Besides, is it not better to wake up alive and able to act than dead or captured? It was with relief that I turned my mare around and made my way, as quickly as possible without attracting undue notice, back to the gates. I was ridiculously lucky to slip past the guards just as the watch changed. A questioning would not have been good for me. I breathed a sigh of relief and trotted away. I would just have to wait for Brahm and Aragon's dramatic escape from the city. I pushed away any doubts and focused on finding a suitable campsite that allowed me to watch the gates without being seen. It would not be that bad, I told myself optimistically. I just had to be patient, and like the old adage, everything would be better. 3 days. 3 days of constant pacing and worrying. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had worn a track around my campsite, and because I did not know when my friends would be leaving the city, I was forced to keep everything ready for a speedy departure. As the days passed, I became tighter and tighter, like a spring being compressed, until it finally snaps. The landscape was not exactly beautiful either, and there was little to distract me from my thoughts. I don't think anything would have distracted me, however, even if I had been surrounded by scenic views. Slowly, I began to reach my snapping point. I had been camped here for 3 days, 3 bloody days, Had I managed my time incorrectly? Were they long gone or still on their way? I had no way of knowing, no neat calendar that could help me solve these endless questions. They made me angry, frustrated, and afraid, emotions that are not conducive to enjoying the place you are stuck in. Behind me, growing on the horizon, was a black storm cloud that told me, quite clearly, it would be a wet and wild night. And then I heard the distant sounds of trumpets. They were coming from the city. Trumpets, my heartbeat speeded up, and I hurried to the very edge of my camp, looking down towards the city. Could it be them? Could it finally and at long last be them? Had, by some wild miracle, we arrived at the same time and now we could meet up? It had to be, for no city would sound alarm trumpets without reason. There was some sort of commotion by the front gates of the city, but I wasted no time watching, and instead, I destroyed any signs of my camp and saddled my mare with shaking hands. She sensed my fear and nerves, tossing her head and dancing on the spot. She made the saddling more difficult than it needed to be. My fumbling fingers slipped on one of the knots, my mind instantly berating myself as I hurried to fix it the right way. I was growing steadily closer to that moment when I would alter fate. Lovely, just lovely isn't this entire mess. Look what you've gotten yourself into, right in over your head. So what are you planning on doing? Leaping in there like an avenging angel, all prepared to bring the wrath of heaven down upon your enemies. Oh, how smart. And when that doesn't work, then be sure to tell me, MMK. I did one final glance around and then leapt aboard my dancing mare. The movement, once so foreign, was now practiced and easy as if I had done it all my life. There was no time for thinking, no time for not doing anything. I needed to go. I needed to do this even if it sent shooting waves of terror through me. Adrenaline burned right to the tips of my fingers, and the world seemed bright, too bright, and the storm lying before me even darker and powerful in its slowly swirling, slowly growing depths. This would be a night of many things, many changes, and it would send us all even deeper into the storm sweeping across this fair land until nothing was left. And I was going to be at the center, and I didn't know how I had managed to get myself so deeply entangled in it. Was it because I was desperate to taste adventure, or because of true friendship? I didn't know. All I knew was that I'd been swept up into it, and nothing I did would cut me free of it. I was part of this story, woven into it, and I wouldn't, in the very end, want it any other way. I pushed my mare into a canter, and it was not long after that I saw the two horses galloping out of Dras Leona. I could not help but smile because, after months of travel, I would be back with my friends. Not even the rising wind or approaching rain clouds or even the upcoming fight with the Razak could dampen my excitement. Because, for once, I had made it on my own and was coming back not because someone demanded I did through a snarky text message or pointed email. I was coming back because I knew what being completely alone and free felt like after my time in this world. It would be good, no, it would be wonderful, to once more be beside my old friends and allies. And there would be two of them. One of them would not end up dead in a sandstone cave. That one would have a chance to tell his only son the truth. I followed at a discreet distance behind the two horses, close enough to see them, but not far enough to be left behind. Their flight continued through the outskirts of Dras Leona as alarm trumpets sounded on the city wall. Looking back on their wild ride, Iragan wished he had been paying more attention to what was behind them. He may not have seen her, for she did not want to be seen, and it was only because of her secrecy that her plan worked. But if he had known who was trailing them, he would have felt a great deal better. As it was neither Iragan, Brahm, or Saphira saw the grey mare or her rider. They were all too focused on getting as far away from Dras Leona as they could, and in one piece after Iragan's disastrous encounter and Brahm's slip-up in the palace. Saphira was waiting for them by the edge of the city, hidden behind some trees. Her eyes burned with fire and her tail whipped back and forth. "Go ride her," said Brahm. "And this time stay in the air, no matter what happens to me. I'll head south and hope we aren't ambushed." The last bit was said under his breath, and Iragan made no comment on it, knowing he was not supposed to have heard it. Finding his familiar handholds, Iragan mounted quickly, and Saphira kicked off hard into the sky. Below them, Iragan watched Brahm gallop along the road on Snowfur and with Kadok beside him. "Are you all right?" asked Saphira. "Yes," said Iragan as he allowed himself to relax slightly against her warm scales, but only because we were very lucky. All the time we've sent looking for the Razak was useless. They knew exactly where we were. Any chance of remaining undetected is impossible after that escape. There will be soldiers everywhere. I know. I only wish the Razak had not been alone. If they had, perhaps then I would have stayed and fought. Was there any sign of Zoe? No. There had been no sign that Zoe had passed through Drasleona, and Aragon felt both guilty and terribly afraid for Zoe. After what had happened in Drasleona, any possibility of waiting for her was gone. The only comfort was that Empire still didn't know about her, but what good would that do her if she was dead? He was sure she wasn't, but they had nothing to back up that feeling, and so he refused to let himself pin his hopes on it when they might so easily be crushed. Think about other things, little one. Zoe would not want you to become so caught up in her fate that you allowed yourself to be captured. There were times like right then that Aragon realized just how much he needed Saphira, how deep their bond was. Thank you, Saphira, she just hummed in response. They flew low and fast. The land they flew over became dry and rocky and filled with tough, sharp bushes and tall cactuses. Clouds darkened the sky and lightning began to flash as the wind rose. It began to buffet Saphira, and Aragon clung tightly to her scales. Finally, Saphira landed and Brahm stopped the horses and asked, "What's wrong?" "The wind is too strong up there," said Aragon, gesturing at the black, roiling sky. Brahm swore loudly and passed Aragon Kadok's reins. They trotted away with Saphira following on foot, though she had difficulty keeping up on the ground. Soon darkness fell and forced them to stop. The moon was a small sliver and gave off little light. The stars shone distantly. The storm had passed, and the world was quieter. It was too dangerous to light a fire, so they ate their food cold while Saphira sheltered them from the. They discussed possible attack scenarios and went over exactly what had happened in Drasleona. Their voices were soft, and at even the slightest sound, they would all flinch and ready for an attack. Aragon was just rising from his seat beside Saphira when he felt the sudden urge to draw his sword. A feeling of urgency and danger, something was there, and he had to be ready to defend himself. It was surprising, strange, and deeply unsettling. It made him draw Zarok and wait, his muscles tense and ready for a fight. Brahm rose beside him and drew his own sword, looking toward the shadows that Aragon felt uneasy about, the elder man knowing better then to question his young student at such a time. During those long, silent moments, Aragon found himself quickly reviewing his lessons in swordsmanship and magic, though he was reluctant to use magic lest he antagonize whoever or whatever was watching them into using it too. Brahm had made it quite clear how dangerous a magician's duel was, especially if you did not know what you were fighting. At least, thought Aragon, I have Saphira with me. A small flicker of movement caught his eye, a bit of color that stood out against the surrounding blackness. He immediately focused on it as he suddenly felt a cold chill of fear stab through him. Raising Zarok, he contacted Brahm and Saphira with his mind. I think the Razak have found us. Brahm took up a fighting position and said, keep close to me and Saphira. Do not allow them to separate us. Do not use magic unless it is our last option. Suddenly, a shadowy figure burst from the shadows with a hair-rising shriek. Aragon just managed to get his blade up fast enough before the Razak was on him. Brahm was quickly engaged in a fierce duel with the other Razak. Aragon was just holding his own. The creature was stronger and faster than he was. All that training and I still can't beat it. Aragon managed to avoid a particular heavy blow. The Razak aimed at his undefended left side, but he wasn't quite fast enough, and the blade nicked him. As the fight progressed, Aragon was forced more and more on the defense, and he was just managing that, let alone deliver a killing strike. Saphira was roaring, but she could not fight the Razak without potentially injuring Aragon and Brahm. She had to settle for trying to catch them with her claws, but even that was risky. Things looked bad, very bad. They were a far cry from winning this fight. But then things were changed. A flaming arrow suddenly flew from somewhere to Aragon's right. The shaft buried itself in the Razak's shoulder with deadly accuracy. The creature screamed, and Aragon nearly dropped Zarok to cover his ears at the horrible sound. Another arrow flew from the same place and hit the Razak that Brahm was dueling. Before Aragon could react and do anything, both of the Razak fled into the shadows. Their black robes were on fire, and they were screaming in pain. The sound of their screams would haunt Aragon's nightmares for weeks after. But the fight was not over. Sudden silence had fallen over the small clearing as Brahm, Iragan, and Saphira spun to face the direction from which this new threat was. For a few quiet seconds nothing happened, and then a cloaked figure stepped from the shadows. Iragan raised Zarok, and Saphira snarled a warning, prepared to fight to the death if she had to. But the longer Iragan stared at the figure, the more confused he became. The person was slim and oddly small. The bow looked oddly familiar, and the person stood in a way that niggled something in Iragan's memory. He felt as if he knew this person, as if the second that hood fell back, he would know them. However, he did not know if, when that happened, he would either have to ready to fight or sheath his sword and welcome them with joy. It was more unsettling than the feeling of sudden warning or the unnatural shriek of the fleeing Razak. The two parties stared at each other. Neither of them were ready or willing to break the uncomfortable silence or make a move to attack. It was as if they were caught in a never-ending cycle which, after a few long minutes, Brahm finally stepped forward. His sword was still held at the ready, and a scowl fixed upon his face. The man said, "Who are you?" In response, the stranger pushed back his her hood to reveal an all too familiar black hair and glittering blue-gray eyes. She flashed them a wide smile and said as if it was so obvious she found it amusing, "Honestly, it's me, Zoe." 8. Murtagh. What do you say to someone you weren't sure you would ever see again? What do you say to them when they just saved your life and look like they haven't been gone a day? Iragan wasn't sure. His mind was pulling up a blank as he stared at the young woman before him. Zoe was wearing the black clothing that she had had when she had first arrived in Alagaesia. Her sword was strapped to her waist, and her horn still hung from its familiar place beside her quiver. Her hair was pulled back in its familiar braid, and she looked quite striking as the little bit of moonlight caught her face and made her eyes sparkle. But she was different. This wasn't the same Zoe who had been separated from their small group by Urgles. This was not the girl who he knew from all those long hours spent in a saddle upon a moving horse. There was an air about her that Iragan could not quite place, and he found himself searching her face and eyes for any clue as to what this mysterious change was. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not pin it down. "So are you two just going to stand there looking like dead fish with your mouths open?" asked Zoe, sounding amused. She pushed a lock of dark hair from her face and readjusted her bow so it wasn't pointed at Brahm and Iragan. "This really isn't the warm and fuzzy reunion I had imagined. Oh well, I suppose I can always just leave again and then come back and save you from your enemies again." Zoe smirked and raised an eyebrow at them. She appeared totally in control and deeply amused by the situation, as if it couldn't have gone better if she tried. She had waltzed in, saved them, and was now laughing at them. It made no sense to the weary rider. His mind was struggling to wrap itself around it, and he doubted it would for a few more hours. Saphira snorted in amusement and said, "Your sense of humor is still the same, Zoe. However, before we catch up on all of our news, we might want to find a more secure campsite." Zoe nodded and said, "I agree, Saphira, but there is someone who is on his way here that needs to show up. If you don't mind, we will wait for him and then continue on. He shouldn't be that long. I think we have a little time before the Razak return." Both Brahm and Iragan exchanged confused glances. Iragan opened his mouth to ask a question, but Zoe shook her head and said firmly, "Not now, Iragan. I know it is confusing, but this isn't the place to explain everything." When Iragan had first left Carvajal, he would have demanded more answers. But after all the things he had experienced, he understood where Zoe was coming from. He would just have to be patient and hope that, when Zoe did choose to answer their questions, she would answer them in full. He could still remember her lecture about the proper time and place for questions. Besides, he was weary and his arms ached after the intense duel he had been engaged in with the black creatures. Was, her grey eyes never leaving his face, that Zoe moved forward and came to a halt in front of him. She examined him closely as if trying to see how much he had changed. It made Iragan feel slightly uncomfortable, but then, to his utter surprise, Zoe embraced him tightly. They both were still holding their weapons, and Iragan was feeling the effects of the past few hours, but it didn't matter. She squeezed him tightly as a sister would, and then, with her hands resting on his shoulders, she drew back. Zoe was smiling, and her eyes danced with amusement. "It's good to see you and Saphira again, Iragan. You've changed, and I think it's for the better." Her voice was low, and around them the trees shifted in the dying wind. He had changed. Zoe seemed to be the one doing all the changing while he still felt like Aragon. Despite all these past months, he was still not good enough to match the skill of the Razak. Would he ever be that good? Would he ever change and find that power? Brahm gave a small chuckle. What about me, Zoe? The man was smiling a rare smile, one not tinted by sorrow, but wide and relaxed. Zoe laughed and wrapped her arms around the old warrior. In an almost fatherly gesture, Brahm rested his free hand gently on the girl's dark hair, and in a voice almost too soft for Aragon to catch, he said, "It is good to have you back, Zoe." The girl released him, and her gaze flicked between Brahm, Aragon, and Saphira. "It is good to be back, and I hope we can speak more soon, but right now, the person we are waiting for is almost here. Please, please trust me. He's very important, and you will need his help later on." Saphira touched Zoe gently with the tip of her snout and said, "If you trust this person, then I am sure you have good reason to." "You must," said the young woman, and her eyes suddenly looked desperate, as if this person was so important that, if they refused their company, she would not know what to do. Zoe turned away, her bow still in her left hand, and whistled. Melanlas trotted out of the trees where she had been waiting for her mistress. The grey mare exchanged friendly nickers with Caddock and Snowfur, who perked their ears at the sight of their old travelling companion. Zoe took her reins and held them with her free hand as she watched the shadows around the small camp fire. Her eyes never moved, and she looked tense. Aragon shifted uneasily and moved closer to Saphira just in case. Too many times recently they had been separated when they should have been together, and he would not make the same mistake again. "Ah, here he comes," said Zoe. Aragon looked at Zoe in surprise and turned back to look in the direction she was staring. Wondering who this person might be, Aragon searched with his mind and found a heavily guarded mind that was aware of his touch approaching. For the second time that night, a hooded figure slipped out of the shadows. The man was holding a bow in one hand, and his face was lost in shadow. His clothes were travel-stained, but he exuded a kind of calm and assured but wary air. Again, silence fell as two groups stared at each other, waiting for the other to break the silence. It was Zoe who broke it. Her voice sounding calm in the still, tense silence, she stepped forward. She held her bow loosely at her side, as if trying to reassure the stranger that she meant him no ill will. "Are you Murtagh?" The figure tensed and raised his bow so that it was held at the ready. Aragon had to fight the urge to raise Zarok, while Brahm looked like he was fighting a similar instinct. Beside him, her body not betraying it, Aragon felt Saphira's muscles subtly clench as she readied to leap forward into Zoe's defense. In a cold voice that was strangely emotional, the man said, "What is it to you?" "I am just a traveler who heard the sounds of a fight and came to investigate." Zoe did not seem at all put out by the obvious hostility. Instead, she just nodded and said in the same diplomatic tone that Aragon had never heard her use before until now, "I am sure you have questions for us, but we cannot linger here. I fear that the Razak will be back soon enough, and this time they will bring soldiers. Will you come with us to a safer location? I think there is a spot not too far away that will do." Aragon was more than little stunned by Zoe's trust in this perfect stranger. What could Zoe possibly see in this man who hadn't even shown them his face? But she continued as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "It would be in your interests if you did decide to come with us." This Murtagh was obviously of the same opinion as Aragon because he said, "You would put your trust so quickly in me. Isn't that foolish, little girl?" "Yes, I am an enemy of the Razak, but how do you know that we are not enemies?" Zoe just shrugged, and her face suddenly looked older than normal as she swiftly mounted Melanlas. "You did not choose your fate, Murtagh. I can sympathize. Do you search for adventure and freedom? Because if you do, then you can be assured that you will find it with us." Murtagh gave a short, tense laugh. "You know much about me. I recognize someone of similar views and opinions as myself." "I do not trust you," snapped Murtagh. Zoe pulled her hood back and up and said simply, "Perhaps you will change your mind on that." Turning her darkened face to look back at Brahm and Aragon, she said, "Aragon, you must ride Saphira." Of course, the rider's first instinct was to protest, but Zoe gave him a piercing look and said in a low voice, "Just do it, please." With a frustrated sigh and one last glance in Murtagh's direction, he sheathed his sword and climbed onto Saphira. Brahm mounted Snowfire, and took Cadoc's reins, while Zoe pushed Melinla's forward with a nudge and said over her shoulder, "Keep an eye out for a safe resting place." With a nod, Iragan and Saphira took off into the dark night. The wind had died down a little, and the dragoness was able to coast along on the currents of wind without having to constantly fight to prevent herself from being pulled too high or low. While Saphira searched for a safe campsite, Iragan was able to relax against her warm neck as he reflected back over the events of that night. They were such startling events, and he could not help but wonder at them with amazement. Zoe was back. The Razak were still alive. Zoe had just put her trust in an unknown man called Murtagh. As if all of these strange events were not difficult enough to comprehend, but added to it all was a sense of deep failure and personal disappointment mixed with anger. Once more he had failed to avenge his uncle's death, and like too many times before, others had had to come to his rescue. When would he be able to protect himself without having to rely on others who were stronger? Oh, Saphira, why did it have to be us? Why did we have to be caught up in such events? I am just a farm boy from Caraval. I can't do this. I can barely hold my own against the Razak, let alone Galbatorix. Saphira was silent for a long time. The only sound was the occasional thump of her wings as she balanced herself, and in the peace and quiet of it all, he felt himself relax a little despite himself. "Sometimes, little one," she said, "we don't have a choice. Fate must have decided you were the right person, and remember that out of all the people I could have chosen to be my rider, I choose you. That counts for something. You aren't alone, Iragan, you have Zoe and Brahm, and maybe this Murtagh will prove to be worthy friend and ally. Trust yourself. I suppose. Believe it. I am seriously beginning to regret saving Brahm's life. Sorry, it's the truth. The old man was seriously getting on my nerves. Why couldn't he just trust my judgment when it came to Murtagh and stop shooting the poor guy's suspicious glares? Perhaps he was right to do it, and had I been in his shoes, I might have felt the same way, but I had hoped he would have a little more trust in my judgment. However, at this particular moment, I could not see that. I was weary, and the lack of sleep was, for the most part, because I had been worrying so insensately over his fate. All of this, when combined, made me want to strangle the man. Finally, I lost my contacted Brahm with my mind. If you do not stop making Murtagh feel like he's about to be stabbed in the back by a mad old storyteller, then I will knock you out, and I do not make idle threats. Brahm shot me a glare and demanded furiously, "How do you know that this man is trustworthy? How do you know that your books aren't wrong?" I ground my teeth in annoyance and switched to the ancient language so that Brahm would know I believed without question what I was saying. You know that everything I have said about the future of this world has been true. Let me inform you of this. In the book, Murtagh saves Iragan's life, and you end up dead by the Razak's hand. It is because of Murtagh that many things occur later, and those are important things that cannot be changed just to ease your worries. But, please, Brahm, I said before he could continue in the same vein, which would only make me more furious. I am not in the mood to deal your questions. So shut up and wait until I can explain things better. With that, I severed the connection and moved Melinla's forward so I rode beside Murtagh. He shot me a wary look, but said nothing, and we rode in silence. Throughout the rest of the ride, I could feel Brahm's furious gaze on my back, but I ignored him. Serves the old bugger right for not having more faith in me, my abilities and my knowledge, which had yet to be proven wrong. It was because of it that he was not currently dying with a knife through his ribs. Me and no one else. Despite the weight of Brahm's glare, the ride gave me a chance to reflect on what had happened these past few hours. I had succeeded. My plan of using fire to frighten and injure the Razak had worked. For good or for ill, Brahm was riding just behind me and Murtagh beside me. I could only hope that, by saving Brahm, I had not set off a series of unfortunate events that would lead to utter disaster. I tightened my hold on my bow, and half amused and half frightened by the thought, I found myself wondering at how much I changed. These past few weeks seemed to be showing me that I had another side, and it was a dangerous side with little patience for foolishness. It seemed everyone was changing from Iragan to the ever-growing Saphira. Brahm, out of the four of us, was the only one who seemed unchanged. There was something comforting in that knowledge. It was strangely nice knowing that some things just didn't change if you were gone for a few weeks and came back after learning a few hard lessons about yourself, the world, and what your place in that world is. Streaks of grey light were beginning to streak the sky to the east when Sapphira contacted me with her mind. There is a good place to stay about 2 miles from where you are. We will see you there then. I turned to my two companions and informed them that Sapphira had discovered a place to stay. Murtagh and Brahm said nothing, just nodded, and we continued on in uncomfortable silence. As we drew nearer to our resting spot, I found myself growing increasingly nervous. What in the world would I tell them? How could I convince Brahm to trust Morzen's son? How about convincing Murtagh to trust his father's killer? Not only that, but Brahm would not have gone into the whole parents thing with Eragon, which would make this all the more difficult. What it all boils down to was this. Is it better to drop all the bombs at once or only drop one or two? I suppose if you want to go for the mega effect, then you just go right ahead and drop them all, run for cover, and then pick up the pieces of rubble later. Despite myself, and knowing it was rather unfair considering the circumstances, I couldn't stop myself from my being annoyed with Brahm. Why couldn't he tell Eragon? He spent so much time lecturing everyone else about not being stupid and taking responsibility for one's actions, but he seemed unable to face this matter. It would not make these following hours any easier and only, if anything, raise the level of tension between everyone. I would need luck. I would a lot of luck, a personal heat shield, and some patience.